Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Horn That Calls Them. From Marcus Chen. The Montana stretch of Highway 2 becomes a different beast after midnight, when the last of the tourist traffic has bedded down in roadside motels, and only we night haulers remain to thread the needle between mountains that rise like sleeping giants on either side. I've been running this route for 15 years, my Peterbilt 379 cutting through the darkness with the steady confidence of a ship following familiar stars. But tonight something feels different in the way the wind carries sounds across the valley floor. My cargo is nothing special, just a load of farming equipment bound for North Dakota, but the truck ahead of me has been keeping my attention for the past 50 miles. It's an older Freightliner, painted in a deep burgundy that looks almost black under the sparse highway lighting, and its driver seems to have the same steady pace I prefer for these long mountain runs. We've been playing a gentle game of leapfrog, taking turns leading through the winding sections where the road follows the contours of ancient creek beds. The radio has been quiet tonight, which isn't unusual for this stretch, but there's something unsettling about the silence that seems to press against my cab windows like a living thing. Even the usual chatter from the truck stops ahead has faded to nothing, leaving only the steady drone of my engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. The moon hangs low and full above the peaks, casting everything in silver and shadow, and I find myself checking my mirrors more often than usual, though I can't say exactly what I'm looking for. It's when we crest the rise near Browning that I first hear it, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I think it might be wind through the mountain passes, or perhaps the distant whistle of a freight train, but there's something deliberate about it, something almost musical in the way it rises and falls. The Freightliner ahead of me begins to slow, and I see the glow of brake lights reflected in his chrome as he pulls onto the shoulder at a scenic overlook that I've passed 1,000 times before. I consider continuing on, maintaining my schedule, and leaving whatever's bothering the other driver to sort itself out, but something in the way his truck sits there, hazards flashing in the darkness, makes me ease off the throttle and follow him onto the gravel pullout. The sound is clearer now, unmistakably the deep haunting call of a truck horn, but stretched out longer than any air horn I've ever heard, rising from somewhere in the valley below us like a lost voice calling across the years. The other driver climbs down from his cab, a lean figure in a baseball cap and flannel jacket, and I can see him looking out over the guardrail toward the source of the sound. I set my parking brake and join him, boots crunching on the loose gravel, and together we stand in the mountain air that carries the scent of pine and something else, something older and harder to name. "You hearing that too?" he asks, his voice carrying a slight southern accent, despite the Montana plates on his trailer. His name is Dale, he tells me, and he's been running freight for 23 years, long enough to know when something doesn't belong in the natural order of a mountain night. The horn sounds again, longer this time, and we both turn toward the valley where scattered lights mark the location of a small town that barely registers on most maps. The sound seems to be coming from down there, from the cluster of buildings that huddle around a single main street like pioneers gathering around a campfire. But there's something wrong with the way the sound carries, something that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I realize that no truck horn should be able to reach us at this elevation, not with that kind of clarity and power. It's as if the mountains themselves are amplifying it, turning the valley into a natural amphitheater for something that shouldn't exist. Dale points toward the town, where we can make out the faint glow of streetlights and what might be the neon sign of a diner or gas station. "My CB's been picking up chatter from down there all night," he says, "but it's all wrong somehow, like voices from a different time, talking about loads and destinations that don't make sense anymore." He pulls a thermos from his cab and offers me coffee that steams in the cold air, and we stand there listening as the horn calls again, joined this time by what sounds like the rumble of heavy engines starting up. The lights in the town below begin to move, and I realize with a chill that runs deeper than the mountain air that they're not streetlights at all, but headlights, dozens of them, forming a convoy that begins to wind its way up the mountain road toward our position. The engines grow louder, a symphony of diesel power that seems to shake the very bedrock beneath our feet, and I find myself backing toward my truck even as part of me wants to stay and watch this impossible procession approach. "We need to go," Dale says, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from years of experience with the unusual and unexplained. Whatever's coming up that road, it's not meant for the living, but even as he speaks I can see the fascination in his eyes, the trucker's curiosity that makes us want to see what's over the next hill, even when every instinct tells us to turn around. The horn sounds again, closer now, and I can hear individual engines in the approaching convoy, the distinctive sounds of different makes and models, from the high whine of older Detroit diesels to the deeper rumble of modern Caterpillars. The headlights are climbing the switchbacks below us with impossible speed, as if the trucks they belong to are unbound by the normal limitations of weight and gravity that govern our world. I'm moving toward my cab when the first of them comes into view, a Kenworth from what might have been the 1970s, its chrome gleaming with a light that seems to come from within rather than reflecting the moon above. The driver is barely visible behind the wheel, just a shadow in a cowboy hat, but I can feel his attention like a physical weight as the truck passes our overlook and continues up the mountain road. More follow, an endless parade of rigs from different eras, some so old I can barely recognize the makes and models, others that look like they might have rolled off the assembly line yesterday but carry themselves with the weight of decades on the road. None of them show any signs of age or wear, their paint gleaming and chrome spotless, as if they've been preserved in some timeless garage between their journeys through the mountain nights. Dale is already climbing into his cab, his earlier curiosity replaced by the kind of urgency that comes from recognizing a danger too large to comprehend. "They're not stopping," he shouts over the rumble of passing engines, but that horn is still calling. I think it's calling for us. His Freightliner roars to life, and I see him pulling onto the highway behind the ghostly convoy, not following them exactly but drawn along in their wake like a leaf caught in a river current. I fire up my own engine and follow, unable to resist the pull of that haunting horn that continues to sound from somewhere ahead of us in the procession. The speedometer climbs past 70, then 80, as we're swept along with trucks that cast no shadows in the moonlight and leave no tracks in the dust that swirls up from the road shoulder. The convoy begins to turn off the main highway onto a side road I've never noticed before, despite 15 years of running this route. It's paved but narrow, winding up into the mountains toward peaks that seem higher and more jagged than they should be. Dale's Freightliner follows without hesitation, and I find my own hands turning the wheel as if controlled by something other than my conscious will. The road climbs through forests that grow denser and darker with each mile until the trees seem to press against the narrow strip of asphalt like living walls. The horn calls again, and this time I can hear something else in its voice, a loneliness that speaks of endless roads and destinations that can never be reached, of drivers who have been traveling so long they've forgotten where they started or why they began the journey. It's then that I see the lights ahead, not the moving headlights of trucks, but the steady glow of a truck stop that spreads across a mountain meadow like a mirage made real. The convoy is pulling in, dozens of rigs finding parking spots in neat rows, their engines winding down with synchronized precision. The horn calls one final time, a sound of welcome and invitation that makes my chest ache with unexplained emotion. Dale's Freightliner slows as we approach the entrance to the truck stop, and I can see him looking back at me in his mirror, his face pale in the dashboard lights. This is the moment of choice, I realize, the point where we decide whether to follow the ghostly convoy into whatever lies beyond the veil of normal reality, or turn back to the world we know and pretend this mountain night never happened. The Mile That Feeds on Motion, from Jake Brennan. The CB radio had been crackling with warnings about mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 for the better part of 3 weeks, but I figured it was just another case of drivers letting their imaginations run wild during those long, lonely stretches through Nevada's high desert. You know how it is out here, too much caffeine, not enough sleep, and suddenly every shadow looks like something waiting to pounce. But when dispatch routed me through that exact stretch with a load of electronics bound for Sacramento, I started paying attention to what the other truckers were saying. They called it the mile that hums with hunger, though none of them could explain exactly what that meant. Some said their rigs would slow down no matter how hard they pressed the accelerator. Others mentioned a sound that seemed to come from beneath the asphalt itself, a low thrumming that made their dental fillings ache. A few claimed their fuel gauges would drop dramatically in that single mile, as if something was feeding on the diesel in their tanks. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing. Mile 247 was different now, changed in a way that made veteran drivers take 20-mile detours just to avoid it. I'd been running this route for 15 years, long enough to know every truck stop, every way station, and every mile marker between Reno and the California border. My Peterbilt 379 had carried me through blizzards in Wyoming, dust storms in Arizona, and fog so thick in Oregon that I couldn't see my own hood ornament. If there was something genuinely wrong with that stretch of highway, I figured I'd be able to handle it better than most. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the Sierra Nevada when I pulled out of the Flying J in Winnemucca, the familiar weight of my trailer settling behind me as I merged onto the interstate. Traffic was light, just a few passenger cars and the occasional RV making their way west toward California. The radio chattered with the usual mix of traffic reports and driver conversations, but I noticed that nobody mentioned mile 24/7. It was as if they were all deliberately avoiding the subject, the way you might avoid talking about a funeral at a wedding. As the miles rolled by, I found myself checking the markers more frequently than usual. Mile 2035, 2038, 2041. Each one passed in routine fashion, the familiar rhythm of road noise and engine hum lulling me into the meditative state that comes with long-distance hauling. The sun had dropped below the mountains now, leaving the desert painted in shades of purple and gold, and I switched on my running lights as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Mile 244 forged and passed without incident, followed by 2045 and 26. I was beginning to think the other drivers had been imagining things, that whatever had spooked them was nothing more than the product of too many energy drinks and not enough rest. But as mile 247 came into view, I felt the first hint that something was genuinely wrong. The sound came first, a low thrumming that seemed to rise from the asphalt itself and travel up through my tires, through the chassis, and into the cab where it resonated in my chest, like the bass note of some enormous organ. It wasn't mechanical. I'd been around trucks long enough to recognize every sound they could make, but organic somehow, rhythmic and purposeful. My speedometer showed 75 miles per hour, the same speed I'd been maintaining for the past hour, but it felt as if I was moving much slower, as if the air itself had thickened around my rig. I glanced at my fuel gauge and felt my stomach tight. The needle had dropped from 3/4 full to just over half in what couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. That was impossible. My Caterpillar engine was well maintained and efficient, and I'd been tracking my fuel consumption carefully since leaving Winnemucca. Even if I'd somehow developed a massive leak, I would have seen the diesel pooling on the highway behind me. The CB radio crackled to life, filled with static and what sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. I tried adjusting the squelch, but the voices only grew louder, their cadence matching the rhythm of whatever was humming beneath my wheels. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead despite the cool evening air flowing through my vent. That's when I noticed the road itself was changing. The asphalt ahead looked different somehow, darker and more textured, as if it had been mixed with something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The yellow center line seemed to pulse with a faint bioluminescence, and the mile marker posts appeared to lean inward like spectators gathering around some invisible attraction. I blinked hard, wondering if fatigue was finally catching up with me, but when I opened my eyes the changes were still there, if anything more pronounced. The humming grew stronger as I passed the mile 247 marker, and I felt my truck suddenly surge forward as if something had grabbed it and pulled. My speedometer jumped to 80, then 85, though I hadn't touched the accelerator. The engine roared with effort, but the sound was wrong, deeper and more resonant than usual, as if my exhaust pipes had somehow tripled in size. Through the windshield I could see the road stretching ahead, but it seemed much longer than a single mile should be, curving and undulating in ways that didn't match my memory of this perfectly straight section of interstate. My fuel gauge continued its impossible descent, the needle now hovering just above the quarter tank mark. The radio had gone completely silent except for that rhythmic whispering, and I realized with growing alarm that I hadn't seen another vehicle since entering this cursed stretch of highway. Even the lights of Lovelock, which should have been visible on the horizon, had disappeared as if swallowed by the darkness. The road surface beneath my wheels had become something else entirely now, black and glistening like wet tar, though no rain had fallen. My headlights illuminated what looked like veins or arteries running through the asphalt, pulsing with the same rhythm as the humming that had now grown so intense. I could feel it in my bones. The yellow lines had become streams of pale light that flowed alongside my truck like luminous rivers, and when I looked in my mirrors I saw that the road behind me was returning to normal asphalt, as if the changes were somehow following my movement. I tried downshifting, hoping to slow my rig's inexplicable acceleration, but the transmission seemed frozen. My Jake brake was similarly unresponsive, and when I pressed the service brakes, I felt no change in speed whatsoever. The truck was no longer under my control, carried forward by forces I couldn't begin to understand. My fuel gauge now registered nearly empty, though I could hear my tank sloshing with what sounded like much more than the few gallons the instrument claimed remained. The CB radio suddenly burst back to life with voices. I recognized other drivers I'd talked with over the years, friends and acquaintances from truck stops across the country, but their words were wrong, spoken in reverse, or in languages that consisted entirely of consonants, and underneath their familiar cadences, I could hear something else speaking, something that used their voices, like a ventriloquist uses a dummy. That's when I understood what was happening. The mile wasn't just hungry, it was feeding, drawing sustenance from every vehicle that passed through it. The fuel, the energy from the engines, even something vital from the drivers themselves. I thought about the truckers who'd been avoiding this stretch, how tired and shaken they'd sounded when they talked about it on the radio. Whatever this thing was, it had been growing stronger, more aggressive in its appetite. My speedometer now showed 90 miles per hour, but the mile 248 marker seemed no closer than when I'd entered this nightmare stretch of asphalt. The road had become something alive, its surface rippling with muscular contractions that propelled my truck forward while simultaneously draining it of everything it needed to function. My engine was beginning to sputter despite the roar coming from my exhaust, and I could smell something burning, not oil or rubber, but something organic and unfamiliar. In desperation, I reached for my cell phone, thinking I might call dispatch or emergency services, but the screen showed no signal in a battery indicator that read 0%, despite having been fully charged when I'd left the truck stop. The device felt warm in my hand, as if something had been drawing power from it, just as aggressively as it was draining my fuel tanks. The whispering voices on the radio had merged into a single chorus now, speaking in unison with words that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my mind. They spoke of hunger that had existed since before the first roads were built, of an appetite that fed on motion itself, on the vital force that powered the endless stream of vehicles crossing the continent. This stretch of highway had become a feeding ground, a trap that sustained itself on the life force of internal combustion engines and the humans who operated them. The Shadow Thief. From Marcus Delano, I've been hauling freight across the American Southwest for nearly 30 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every strange thing these endless highways had to offer. Desert mirages that looked like lakes, dust devils that danced like ghosts in the twilight, and those peculiar little towns that seemed to exist only at 3 in the morning when you're fighting sleep and running on truck stop coffee. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless October night outside of Nowhere, Nevada. It was one of those runs where everything starts normal enough. I was piloting my trusty Kenworth W900, a royal blue beauty I'd named Midnight Express, loaded down with electronics bound for Reno. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, their voices creating a comfortable backdrop of human connection across the vast darkness. My dashboard lights cast their familiar green glow across the cab, and the steady rumble of my Caterpillar engine provided that rhythmic lullaby that had become the soundtrack to my life on the road. The night air was crisp and clear, carrying that distinctive desert scent of sage and dust through my slightly cracked windows. Stars scattered across the velvet sky like scattered diamonds, so bright and numerous they seemed almost artificial to someone who'd spent most of his youth in the light-polluted cities of the East Coast. My headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead, illuminating the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched toward the horizon. Not unusual in itself, drivers often traveled similar routes and speeds, creating impromptu convoys that could last for hundreds of miles. This one appeared to be another long-haul rig, though the distance and darkness made it difficult to determine the exact make and model. Its headlights maintained a steady following distance, neither gaining nor losing ground, which suggested an experienced professional at the wheel. What struck me as odd, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why at first, was how the headlights seemed to float in the darkness behind me. Most trucks, you see them as a complete silhouette against the star-filled sky, a blocky shadow that breaks up the horizon line. But this one, it was as if only the headlights existed. Two bright points suspended in the void like electronic eyes watching my every move. I tried raising the driver on the CB, cycling through the common channels with the usual trucker greeting. "Eastbound Kenworth to the rig running behind me, you got your ears on?" Nothing but static answered me back. I tried again, using different channels, even attempted the emergency frequency, but received only that empty white noise that seems to amplify the vastness of the desert night. Miles rolled by in this strange procession, my rig leading while those disembodied headlights maintained their perfect following distance. I began to pay closer attention to my mirrors, adjusting them slightly to get a better view, squinting against the glare to try to make out more details of my silent companion. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Where there should have been the dark bulk of a cab and trailer interrupting the starlight, there was nothing, just those two unwavering points of light, floating in the blackness. I told myself it was a trick of distance and perspective, that the other truck was simply far enough back that its silhouette blended with the darkness. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, a cold unease began to settle in my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. I'd been driving these highways long enough to know when something wasn't right, and every instinct I'd developed over 3 decades on the road was screaming warnings. The CB chatter from other drivers had faded to nothing, leaving me alone with the whisper of wind across my cab and the steady drone of my engine. Even the radio seemed affected, picking up only static between stations, as if something was interfering with the electromagnetic spectrum around us. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed normal readings, but the air in the cab felt charged somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the very atmosphere seems to hold its breath. I decided to test my follower, gradually reducing my speed from 70 to 60, then down to 55. The headlights behind me adjusted accordingly, maintaining that same precise distance with mechanical perfection. No human driver I'd ever known could maintain such exact spacing for so long, especially not without any radio communication or coordination. Most truckers would have pulled around by now, or at least closed the distance to signal their intention. When I accelerated back to highway speed, those floating lights matched my pace effortlessly, as if connected to my truck by some invisible tether. The precision was unnerving. Too perfect, too calculated. It reminded me of those military formation flying demonstrations, where jets seemed to move as one organism rather than separate vehicles controlled by individual pilots. In all my years of night driving, I'd become accustomed to the interplay of headlights and shadows on the road surface. When another vehicle follows you, even at a considerable distance, you can see the sweep and shift of their light beams as they navigate curves and small elevation change. The road behind you becomes alive with moving shadows and illuminated patches that dance and flow like water. It was as if the light was somehow disconnected from any physical source, existing independently of the laws that governed normal illumination. My own headlights threw the familiar patterns ahead. My cab created its expected shadow when passing under the occasional highway light. But behind me, these phantom beams seemed to exist in a space where normal physics held no sway. I reached for my CB handset again, this time trying to reach any driver within range. "This is Midnight Express eastbound on Highway 50. Anybody out there reading me?" The static that answered seemed different now, almost purposeful in its emptiness. as if the very air was absorbing my words before they could travel more than a few feet from my antenna. The next time I checked my mirrors, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The headlights had moved closer, much closer, though I hadn't seen them approaching gradually as would be natural. One moment they were at their usual following distance. The next they were riding perhaps 20 feet from my rear trailer doors, close enough that I should have been able to see every detail of the pursuing truck's front end. Instead, I saw nothing but those two boozing orbs of light, now large enough that they filled my mirror view entirely. There was no radiator grille gleaming in my taillights, no windshield reflecting my marker lights, no solid form whatsoever, just pure white light that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, like the heartbeat of some vast electronic creature stalking me through the desert night. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I felt my truck being pushed by some invisible force, not roughly or violently, but with a steady, insistent pressure that was gradually accelerating my rig beyond the speed I was calling for with my right foot. My speedometer climbed past 70, then 75, then 80, though my accelerator pedal remained in the same position it had been maintaining for the past hour. I tried downshifting to use engine braking to slow down, but my transmission seemed to be locked in gear, unresponsive to my inputs. The brake pedal felt normal under my foot, but produced no reduction in speed when I applied pressure. Instead, we continued to accelerate, my truck and its impossible pursuer, racing through the darkness at speeds that made the desert landscape blur past my windows like a fever dream. Despite the increasing velocity, there was no sensation of my truck straining or struggling with the pace being forced upon it. My engine maintained its steady rhythm, my steering remained responsive and light, and aside from the climbing numbers on my speedometer, I might have been traveling at a leisurely cruise speed on a Sunday afternoon. Other trucks had appeared in the distance ahead, their running lights visible like constellations that had descended from the sky to travel the Earth's surface. As we approached each one at our supernatural speed, I could see them clearly illuminated in my headlights for the brief moments before we flashed past. But something was wrong with every single one. Their headlights created no pools of illumination ahead of them. Their brake lights and marker lights were visible, but produced no corresponding red glow on their trailers or the asphalt around them. They were like ghost images projected onto the night, present but somehow not entirely there, existing in the same strange space between reality and impossibility that had claimed my pursuer. As we passed each phantom truck, I caught glimpses of their cabs and thought I could see figures behind the windshields, silhouettes that might have been drivers hunched over steering wheel. The Serpent's Feed. From Marcus Chen. The amber glow of the fuel station materialized through my rain-streaked windshield like a mirage in the Nebraska darkness, its fluorescent canopy casting weak pools of light across the empty asphalt. My Peterbilt's diesel engine rumbled with the satisfied purr of 18 hours on the interstate, but the fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, forcing this unscheduled stop at a station I'd never noticed before, despite running this route for nearly 8 years. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m., that dead hour when the world feels suspended between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's uncertainties, when even the most familiar highway can transform into something alien and unwelcoming. As I eased my rig toward the Diesel Islands, the rain that had been my companion since Omaha intensified, drumming against the cab's roof with increasing urgency. The station appeared newly constructed yet strangely dated, its architectural style reminiscent of those roadside stops from decades past, complete with large plate glass windows and chrome accents that reflected the neon signage in fragmented rainbows. A single fluorescent tube flickered erratically above the fuel pumps, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the wet pavement like restless spirits. The building itself seemed deserted, though a warm yellow glow emanated from within, suggesting someone maintained a presence during these lonely overnight hours. I pulled up to pump number 4, the furthest from the building, a habit born from years of maneuvering oversized loads through tight spaces. The silence that greeted me when I shut off the engine felt profound, almost oppressive, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Even the usual highway noise seemed muted here, as if this place existed in its own pocket of quiet isolation. I grabbed my fuel card and rain jacket, steeling myself for the inevitable soaking that accompanied any outdoor activity during Nebraska's spring storm season. Nothing appeared unusual about the pump itself, a standard commercial unit identical to thousands I'd used throughout my career, yet something about its presence unsettled me in ways I couldn't articulate. Perhaps it was the way the flickering fluorescent light above cast shifting shadows across its surface, or how the rain seemed to avoid striking it directly, leaving the nozzle mysteriously dry despite the downpour surrounding us both. I attributed these observations to fatigue and the disorienting effects of driving through severe weather for extended periods. When I lifted the nozzle from its resting place, it felt oddly warm despite the cool night air, as though it had been recently used, though no other vehicles were present in the station. I inserted my fuel card, followed the familiar prompts on the pump's display screen, and prepared to begin refueling. The moment I squeezed the trigger, however, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the usual mechanical clicking and fluid gurgling that accompanies diesel fuel flowing through the system, the nozzle began to emit a sound I had never encountered before in 2 decades of commercial driving. It was a hiss, soft and continuous, like air escaping from a punctured tire, but with an organic quality that suggested something far more unsettling. The sound wasn't coming from the pump's mechanical components or the fuel lines, but seemed to originate from within the nozzle itself, as though the metal housing contained something alive and breathing. I paused, listening intently, wondering if I was experiencing some form of auditory hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the storm's atmospheric pressure. But the hissing continued, steady and rhythmic, almost like the breathing of a large animal in deep sleep. Diesel fuel flowed normally into my tank, the pump's digital display tracking gallons and dollars with mechanical precision. Yet that strange hissing persisted throughout the entire process. I found myself unconsciously synchronizing my own breathing with the sound, inhaling and exhaling in time with whatever force was creating this unusual phenomenon. The sensation was hypnotic, almost meditative, and I began to feel drowsy despite my growing unease about the situation. Minutes passed as I stood there in the rain, transfixed by the serpentine sound emanating from the fuel nozzle, barely noticing as the storm intensified around me. It was only when the pump's automatic shutoff engaged, indicating a full tank, that I snapped back to full awareness of my surroundings. The hissing had grown louder during my trance-like state, no longer resembling escaping air, but something more deliberate and purposeful, like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. As I prepared to return the nozzle to its cradle, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, despite the humid night air. The rubber fuel hose, which had been neatly coiled when I arrived, now writhed slightly in a pattern that defied explanation by wind or mechanical vibration. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception, but the movement continued, subtle yet unmistakable. The hose seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, expanding and contracting like the body of some enormous serpent digesting a recent meal. The hissing grew more pronounced, taking on what I could only describe as an irritated tone, as though my presence was no longer welcome at this remote fueling station. Every instinct developed over years of long-haul trucking screamed at me to complete the transaction and leave immediately, but I found myself frozen in place, mesmerized by the impossible sight before me. That's when I noticed my reflection in the pump's display screen had changed. Instead of showing my familiar weathered face beneath a rain-soaked cap, the screen revealed something else entirely, something with scales where skin should be and eyes that glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fluorescent fixtures above. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the nozzle, but managed to maintain my grip as the hissing reached a crescendo that seemed to resonate through my bones. The thing in the reflection opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and I realized with dawning horror that the hissing wasn't coming from the fuel system at all. It was coming from me, emerging from my own throat in perfect synchronization with the creature staring back from the display screen. Somehow, during those hypnotic minutes of refueling, something had begun to change within me, something connected to this place and whatever force had constructed it in the Nebraska wilderness. I tried to speak, to call out for help, but only that continuous serpentine hiss emerged from my lips, growing stronger and more insistent with each passing second. The transformation was accelerating, and I could feel my thoughts becoming clouded, my human concerns fading beneath more primitive impulses. With tremendous effort, I forced myself to hang up the nozzle and stumble back toward my truck's cab, fighting against the overwhelming urge to remain at the pump and continue whatever process had begun. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, as though the station itself was trying to hold me in place, to complete whatever change had been initiated by that first seemingly innocent hiss from the fuel nozzle. Rain pounded against my back as I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I started the engine and threw the transmission into gear. As I pulled away from the station, I glanced back through my mirrors to see the building fading into the storm-swept darkness, its neon signs flickering once before going completely dark. Within moments it had vanished entirely, as though it had never existed at all, leaving only empty highway and agricultural fields stretching endlessly into the night. I drove for another hour before finding a legitimate truck stop, where I parked and tried to process what had occurred at that impossible place in the Nebraska countryside. But even now, weeks later, I find myself listening carefully whenever I fuel up, worried that I might hear that soft, hypnotic hissing again. And sometimes, late at night when exhaustion weighs heavy on my shoulders, I catch myself making that sound without conscious effort. A gentle serpentine whisper that seems to call out to something waiting patiently alongside America's endless highways. Something that knows my truck's registration number and is perfectly willing to wait for our next inevitable encounter at some lonely fuel station in the pre-dawn darkness. Exit 23-7, the road that takes you home. From Marcus Del Rey. The thing about driving interstate routes for 23 years is that you start to know every mile marker, every rest stop, every exit ramp, like the lines on your own weathered hands. Highway 81 through Virginia has been my regular run for the better part of a decade, hauling everything from furniture to electronics between Richmond and Bristol, and I could navigate that stretch blindfolded in my 18 Peterbilt. The hum of her Fixie 5-horsepower engine has become my lullaby, the gentle vibration through the steering wheel my constant companion through countless midnight hauls. It was a Tuesday in late October when I first noticed exit 23-7, though I'm certain it had never been there before. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a steady 2:47 a.m., and a light drizzle had started to speckle my windshield, creating tiny prisms in the glow of my headlights. I'd been fighting to stay alert for the past hour, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos, and occasionally opening the window to let the cool autumn air slap some life back into my tired eyes. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other night haulers, but mostly it was just me, the road and the steady rhythm of 18 wheels rolling through the darkness. The exit sign appeared in my headlight beams like something emerging from a dream, white letters on that familiar green background, reading exit 23-7, Millbrook Road. What struck me as odd wasn't just that I'd never seen this exit before, but something about the sign itself seemed different. The reflective letters had an almost luminescent quality, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat made of light. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, there it was, growing larger as I approached. Now, I'm not the type of driver who takes unknown exits, especially not in the middle of the night with a full load of electronics bound for Tennessee. Time is money in this business, and detours are costly mistakes that eat into already thin profit margins. But something about that exit sign kept drawing my attention, and as I passed it, I found myself glancing in my side mirror to watch it disappear into the darkness behind me. The exit ramp curved away into what looked like dense woodland, lit by a single sodium vapor light that cast everything in an amber glow that seemed almost honey-thick in the misty air. Same sign, same luminescent quality to the letters, same amber-lit ramp disappearing into the trees. This time I knew something wasn't right, because I'd been driving this route for years, and there definitely weren't two exits with the same number. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only the familiar exits I'd known for years, with no mention of any Millbrook Road or exit. The CB radio had gone silent, not even the usual static, just an odd sort of electronic humming that seemed to harmonize with the drone of my engine. By the third time I saw the sign 45 minutes later, I knew I was dealing with something beyond normal highway administration errors or GPS glitches. The rain had picked up, drumming a steady rhythm on my cab roof, and my windshield wipers swept back and forth with a hypnotic regularity that made the yellow centerline seem to pulse and flow like a river of paint. Each time I passed exit 237, I felt an increasingly strong urge to take it, as if something were gently tugging at my consciousness, whispering that this road would take me somewhere I needed to be. The fourth time the sign appeared, I was ready for it, but what I wasn't prepared for was how different it looked. The letters seemed brighter, more insistent, and below the usual text, new words had appeared. Portal home, all travelers welcome. The amber light at the top of the exit ramp flickered in a pattern that almost resembled Morse code, though I couldn't decipher what message it might be sending. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to make my scheduled delivery, but something made me ease off the accelerator as I approached the off-ramp. At first, just glimpses in my peripheral vision, other big rigs taking the exit, their running lights creating streams of red and amber in the rainy darkness. But when I looked directly at them, they seemed translucent, like images projected onto the night air. I could see the familiar shapes of different truck models, Kenworths and Freightliners and Macs, but they had an ethereal quality that made me question whether I was actually seeing them, or whether my exhausted mind was creating phantoms from the interplay of rain and headlights. The fifth appearance of exit 2037 came with a revelation that sent cold tendrils of fear creeping up my spine. As my headlights illuminated the sign, I could see beneath the main text a growing list of names and dates, appearing and disappearing like messages on an old-fashioned electronic bulletin board. I caught glimpses of Robert Chen, 2019, Maria Santos, 2021, and dozens of others, all truckers' names paired with recent years. The implications hit me like a physical blow, and I pressed harder on the accelerator, determined to push past this supernatural exit and continue to my destination. No matter how fast I drove, exit 2037 kept appearing with increasing frequency, every 15 minutes, then every 10, then every 5. The names on the sign were scrolling faster now, and I began to recognize some of them, drivers I'd known who had disappeared without explanation over the past few years, drivers whose empty trucks had been found abandoned on remote highways, with no sign of where they'd gone or why they'd left their rigs behind. The rain was falling harder now, turning the highway into a river of reflecting light, and my wipers could barely keep up with the deluge. The CB radio had started playing what sounded like distant music, a haunting melody that seemed to be calling me towards something just beyond my understanding. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as I approached exit 237 for what I counted as the 8th time, and I noticed that the exit ramp was no longer empty. A line of trucks was taking the exit, their parking lights creating a procession of fallen stars descending into the amber-lit darkness. This time I couldn't resist. Something deeper than curiosity, stronger than fear, compelled me to signal right and ease my Peterbilt onto the off-ramp. The moment my wheels left the interstate, the sound of rain on my windshield stopped, though I could still see drops beating on the glass. The world around me took on that same amber quality as the light at the top of the ramp, and everything seemed to move in slow motion, as if I were driving through honey-thick air. The road beyond the exit was perfectly maintained, smooth black asphalt stretching into darkness between towering pine trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of interwoven branches overhead. Other trucks filled the road ahead of me, a convoy of lost haulers, all moving at the same steady pace towards some unseen destination. I tried to radio them, but my CB only produced that same haunting melody, now louder and more insistent. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the forest opened into a vast clearing, where dozens of trucks sat parked in neat rows, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber stars against the dark ground. The drivers stood beside their rigs, and as I passed them, they waved with slow, mechanical movements, their faces obscured by the amber light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. They gestured for me to park, to join their eternal rest stop, to become part of this collection of lost travelers who had found their way to this place between places. I understood with crystal clarity that this wasn't just a supernatural detour, it was a trap, a collection point for drivers who had spent so many years on the road that they'd become lost between destinations, caught in the liminal space between departure and arrival. The trucks, the drivers, the entire rest area existed in a state of permanent transit, forever paused at a stopping point that wasn't quite real and wasn't quite imagined. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, yanking my steering wheel hard left, and somehow found myself back on the exit ramp, but heading in the wrong direction, up the slope toward the interstate. My mirrors showed the amber-lit clearing dissolving behind me like morning mist, and within seconds I was back on Highway 81, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rain resumed its drumming on my roof, and the CB crackled back to life with normal chatter from other drivers, reaching through the veil. From Marcasol, the fog rolled in like a living thing, that Tuesday night somewhere between Bakersfield and Los Angeles, thick and silver under the highway lights, swallowing my Peterbilt's headlights whole. I've been running the same route for 12 years now, hauling produce from the Central Valley down to the coast, and I thought I knew every mile of Interstate 5 like the lines on my weathered hands. The radio had been crackling warnings about dense fog advisories since Grapevine, but I'd driven through plenty of California soup before. This time felt different, though I couldn't say why at first. My rig's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I downshifted, slowing from 70 to 40, then down to 30 miles per hour. The fog seemed to press against my windshield like curious fingers, so thick I could barely make out the yellow lines beneath my wheels. The usual parade of taillights ahead of me had vanished completely, leaving me alone in a world of gray nothingness. Even my CB radio had gone silent. Nothing but static where the chatter of other drivers should have been. The only sounds were the steady thrum of my engine and the rhythmic whisper of my wipers clearing moisture that seemed to seep through the glass itself. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes in this blindness when I first noticed something odd about the fog's movement. In my peripheral vision, through the passenger window, the gray mass seemed to be flowing in patterns that defied the gentle breeze I could feel buffeting my truck. Instead of the usual random swirls and eddies, there were deliberate shapes forming and dissolving, like smoke from a campfire that someone was shaping with their hands. I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on my eye. I'd been on the road for 8 hours already, and fog could make anyone's imagination run wild. As I crept past what must have been the Fraser Park exit, though I couldn't see the signs through the gray curtain, a tendril of fog stretched out from the main mass and brushed against my driver's side mirror. Not just moved near it or flowed around it, but deliberately reached for it, like a blind person feeling for a doorknob. The appendage was roughly the thickness of a human arm, with what looked disturbingly like fingers at its tip, fingers made of condensed moisture and night air that seemed to possess their own intelligence. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with one hand, while keeping the other steady on the wheel. When I looked again, the arm-like projection had withdrawn, melting back into the general fog bank as if it had never existed. My heart was beating a little faster now, and I reached for the CB handset to see if any other drivers were experiencing anything similar. The radio responded with nothing but empty static, That particular kind of dead air that made me feel like I might be the only person left in the world. The fog grew thicker as I descended toward the valley floor, so dense now that I couldn't see my own hood ornament. I was navigating purely by the feel of the road beneath my tires and the occasional glimpse of painted lines, when my headlights managed to penetrate the gray wall for a few precious inches. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed the outside air dropping steadily, and I could see my breath fogging inside the cab, despite the heater running full blast. Condensation was forming on the inside of my windows now, creating an additional layer between me and the world outside. That's when the reaching began in earnest. First one arm, then two, then dozens of foggy appendages began extending from the main body of mist, all of them stretching toward my truck with unmistakable purpose. They moved with the fluid grace of underwater plants swaying in a current, but there was nothing random about their motion. These were deliberate gestures, reaching and grasping with what could only be described as intention. Some of them were thin as pencils, others thick as telephone poles, but all of them ended in those unsettling finger-like projections that seemed to be feeling for something specific. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the fog moved with me, matching my speed exactly. The arms grew bolder, reaching further from their misty body to brush against my trailer, my cab, my mirrors. I could hear them now, a soft padding sound, like gentle rain, as they made contact with the metal surfaces of my rig. Through my side window I watched in fascination and growing terror, as one particularly large appendage traced the outline of my door handle with delicate precision, as if memorizing its shape and location. The fog began to take on a faint luminescence, a pearl-like glow that seemed to come from within its depths rather than from any external light source. In that ethereal radiance I could see that the arms numbered in the hundreds now, perhaps thousands, all reaching and searching and feeling their way through the night air. Some were exploring the guardrails on either side of the highway, others were stretched upward toward the invisible sky, but most were focused on my truck with an attention that made my skin crawl. But instead of a human voice, all that came through the speaker was a sound like wind through a canyon, a hollow rushing noise punctuated by what might have been whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The sound rose and fell in rhythm with the movement of the fog arms outside my windows, and I realized with a chill that ran down my spine that the two phenomena were somehow connected. I tried calling out on the radio, pressing the talk button and speaking into the handset with what I hoped was a steady voice. "This is Big Dog eastbound on the 5-mile marker unknown. Anybody out there copy?" But my words seemed to be swallowed by the static before they could even leave the cab, and the whispered response that came back sounded like it was coming from somewhere much closer than any other truck on the highway. The arms began to press against my windows, now flattening against the glass like pale hands trying to peer inside. I could see the individual finger-like projections clearly, each one moving independently as they traced patterns on the fog-slicked surface. They left no marks, no streaks in the condensation, but I could feel their presence like a physical weight against the sides of my cab. The temperature inside continued to drop despite my heater's best efforts, and I realized that my breath was now coming out in visible puffs with each exhalation. It was then that one of the arms found my partially open driver's window. I kept it cracked about an inch even in cold weather, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up completely. But now I watched in horror as tendrils of mist began to seep through that narrow opening like smoke through a keyhole. The fog entered my cab with purpose, immediately beginning to explore the interior with those same deliberate, searching movements I'd been watching outside. The fog was inside now, forming arm-like projections that reached across my dashboard, examining my logbook, my coffee cup, my cell phone charger. One tendril stretched toward my face, and I jerked away from it instinctively, though when it made contact with my cheek the touch was surprisingly gentle, almost curious. It felt like being caressed by a cool, damp cloth, but there was an intelligence behind the touch that made every nerve in my body scream with primitive alarm. The fog arm withdrew from my face and began to explore the steering wheel, wrapping around it like a snake coiling around a branch. For a terrifying moment I felt resistance when I tried to turn, as if something else was fighting me for control of the truck. The wheel pulled to the right despite my efforts to keep it straight, and I had to use both hands and all my strength to prevent the rig from drifting off the roadway into the invisible darkness beyond the shoulder. More arms were seeping through the ventilation system now, emerging from the heating vents like ghostly tentacles. They moved through the cab's interior with systematic thoroughness, investigating every surface, every control, every personal item I kept within reach. One particularly bold appendage reached for my CB handset, and when it made contact, the radio exploded with that same hollow rushing sound, but louder now. So loud that I had to cover my ears with my hand. In that moment of distraction, with my hands off the wheel and my eyes squeezed shut against the sonic assault, I felt the truck beginning to drift. When I opened my eyes and grabbed for the steering wheel, I realized I could no longer see the road lines at all. The fog had become so thick that my headlights illuminated nothing but gray void in every direction. I had no way of knowing if I was still on the highway, or if I'd wandered onto the shoulder, or worse, into the median or off the roadway entirely. The smile that followed me home. From Marcus. The thing about driving nights is, you learn to trust your mirrors more than your eyes. After 18 years hauling freight across these endless highways, I've developed an almost religious relationship with those rectangles of reflected reality. The passenger mirror shows me what's coming up alongside. The big convex one mounted high gives me the wide view of traffic, and that driver's side mirror, well, that one's become like an old friend. It tells me who's been following too close, who's getting impatient, and who I need to keep an eye on. That Tuesday night in October, I was running a standard route from Memphis to Little Rock, my Peterbilt loaded down with auto parts that needed to be at the distribution center before dawn. The weather had been cooperating all evening, just a light drizzle that made the asphalt gleam under the highway lights like black silk. My CB was crackling with the usual chatter from other drivers, warnings about speed traps and weather conditions ahead. The kind of background noise that becomes as comforting as a heartbeat when you spend your life on the road. I remember checking that driver's side mirror around 11:30, somewhere between exit markers in a stretch of Arkansas highway that runs straight as a ruler through pine forests that seem to go on forever. The road behind me was empty except for distant headlights. Probably another trucker running late, or an insomniac making their way home from somewhere they'd rather forget. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have made me look twice, but something about those headlights seemed different. They weren't the typical white or slightly yellow glow of most vehicles, but had an almost blue tint to them, like starlight filtered through ice. The rain started coming down harder around midnight, fat drops that drummed against my windshield with increasing intensity, until I had to turn the wipers up to their fastest setting. The rhythmic sweep and thump became hypnotic, mixing with the steady rumble of my engine and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. I glanced in the mirror again and saw those same blue-tinted headlights, maintaining exactly the same distance they'd held for the past 30 miles. That's when I started paying attention. But these headlights seemed frozen in place relative to my truck, like they were tethered to my rear bumper by an invisible rope. I tested this theory by gradually increasing my speed from 65 to 70. Then to 75. The lights maintained their distance perfectly. When I slowed back down to 60, they slowed too, never gaining, never falling back. The really unsettling part came when I tried to get a better look at the vehicle in my mirror. Most times, even at night, you can make out the general shape of what's behind you, distinguish between a sedan and an SUV, maybe catch a glimpse of the driver if they pass under a highway light just right. But this vehicle seemed to exist only as those twin points of cold blue light. The space between and around them appeared to be not just dark, but actively black, like someone had cut a hole in the world, and these lights were all that kept it from swallowing everything else. I reached for my CB radio, thinking I'd ask if any other drivers could see what was behind me, maybe get someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But before I could key the microphone, I caught sight of something in the mirror that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. There, floating in that impossible darkness between the headlights, was a smile. Not a reflection of my own face, not some trick of light and shadow playing across a windshield. This was a smile that belonged to no human face I'd ever seen, stretched impossibly wide and glowing with the same cold blue radiance as those headlights. It was the kind of smile that spoke of secrets and hungers, of things that wait in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The lips, if they could be called lips, seemed to extend far beyond what any mouth should contain, curving upward in an expression of pure, malevolent joy. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road ahead. When I looked back in the mirror a few seconds later, the smile was gone, leaving only those twin points of blue light hovering in the darkness. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a product of too much caffeine and too little sleep, but my body knew better. Every nerve was singing with the kind of primal alarm that kept our ancestors alive when much worse things than highway traffic hunted in the night. The next 20 miles passed in a haze of growing dread. Every time I checked the mirror, those lights were still there, maintaining their perfect distance, and twice more I caught glimpses of that terrible smile. The second time it seemed wider somehow, as if whatever was wearing it had grown more amused by my fear. The third time I could swear I saw teeth, row upon row of them, gleaming like polished bone in the blue radiance. I started looking for a place to pull off, thinking maybe I could let whatever this thing was pass by, but every exit I approached, every rest area and truck stop, seemed to slide past my windshield before I could react. It was as if time itself had become elastic, stretching the distance between safe harbors until they might as well have been on the moon. My CB radio had gone silent, not even the crackle of static, and when I tried to tune to different channels, I got nothing but that same dead quiet. That's when I realized the rain had stopped, though I couldn't remember when. The windshield wipers continued their rhythmic sweep across dry glass, squeaking with each pass in a sound that seemed to echo the cadence of that horrible smile. I reached to turn them off, and as my hand moved toward the controls, I saw something in the mirror that nearly sent my truck off the road. The smile was closer now, much closer. Close enough that I could see it wasn't attached to any face at all. It simply floated in that blue radiance, like a Cheshire cat's grin. But where Carol's creation had been mischievous, this thing radiated pure malice. And it was growing larger. Not just closer, but actually expanding, as if the thing behind those lights was opening its impossible mouth wider and wider. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, feeling my Peterbilt surge forward with a roar that seemed to shake the very air around us. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90, pushing toward speeds that would get my license pulled and my career ended. But I didn't care. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that floating nightmare in my mirror. For a moment it seemed to work. The smile grew smaller, the blue lights fell back, and I began to hope that whatever this thing was, it had limits, that it couldn't match the raw power of nearly 500 horses under my hood. But then I realized my mistake. The lights weren't falling back because I was outrunning them. They were falling back because they were positioning themselves for something else. The CB radio crackled back to life, but instead of the familiar voices of other drivers, I heard something that will haunt me until my dying day. It was laughter, low and bubbling, like the sound of something drowning in its own joy. And underneath that laughter, barely audible but unmistakably there, was the sound of my own voice calling for help, over and over, as if I were trapped somewhere far away and screaming into a void that would never answer. I ripped the CB microphone from its mount and threw it to the floor of the cab. But the laughter continued, now seeming to come from the very walls of the truck itself. The smile in the mirror had returned, larger than ever, and I could see that those weren't teeth gleaming in its depth. They were headlights, hundreds of them, stretching back into an impossible distance, each pair belonging to trucks that had traveled this road before me, drivers who had seen this same smile and never made it home. The highway ahead began to curve, a long sweeping turn that would take me over a bridge spanning the Arkansas River. As I approached the apex of that curve, I made a decision born of desperation and 18 years of highway wisdom. Instead of following the road across the bridge, I yanked the wheel hard to the right and sent my truck crashing through the guardrail into the pine forest beyond. The impact threw me against my seatbelt hard enough to crack ribs, and the world became a chaos of snapping branches, screaming metal, and the deep groan of ancient trees giving way before 40 tons of steel and cargo. My truck plowed through the undergrowth for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before coming to rest against a pine, so large it must have been growing when the first Europeans set foot in Arkansas. I sat there in the sudden silence, tasting blood and listening to the tick and ping of my cooling engine. The bunk that breathes. From Markisk. I've been hauling freight across the continental United States for nearly 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Bad weather, worse drivers, truck stops that looked like they belonged in horror movies, and cargo that made strange noises in the dead of night. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during that week in October, when my regular Peterbilt went down for major engine work just outside of Springfield, Missouri. The dispatcher at headquarters wasn't too happy about the delay, but they managed to arrange a loaner rig from a local outfit called Heartland Transport. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete Kowalski, met me at his small yard on the outskirts of town. The place had that weathered look of a business that had seen better decades, with rust-stained concrete and weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt. Pete led me to a midnight blue Freightliner Classic that looked to be from the early 90s, its paint job still remarkably pristine despite its obvious age. "She's been sitting for a while," Pete explained as he handed me the keys, his voice carrying a slight wheeze that suggested too many years of cigarettes and diesel fumes. Previous driver retired suddenly, said he wanted to spend more time with his family. Can't say I understand it, but then again I never had much family to speak of. He paused, looking at the truck with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She's got some peculiarities, but she'll get you where you need to go. Just remember to treat her with respect." I thanked him and climbed into the cab, immediately noticing how well maintained everything was inside. The seats were reupholstered in rich burgundy leather, and the dashboard gleamed with fresh polish. The sleeper berth behind the driver's seat was more spacious than I was used to, fitted with what appeared to be genuine wood paneling and carpeting that looked recently installed. For a truck that had been sitting idle, everything seemed remarkably fresh and clean. The engine turned over with a deep, throaty rumble that spoke of serious horsepower under the hood. I spent a few minutes familiarizing myself with the controls, adjusting mirrors and seat position, before pulling out of Kowalski's yard and heading toward the interstate. My destination was Portland, Oregon, with a load of manufacturing equipment that needed to be delivered within 5 days. It was a straightforward run west on Interstate 40, the kind of drive I could practically do in my sleep. The Freightliner handled beautifully, its engine purring with a smooth consistency that made the miles disappear beneath the wheels. I made good time across Missouri and Kansas, stopping only for fuel and mandatory rest break. The weather stayed clear and mild, with that perfect autumn crispness that made driving a pleasure rather than a chore. It was somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, on the third night, that I first noticed something unusual about the sleeper berth. I had pulled into a rest area near Vail to grab some sleep before tackling the mountain passes in the morning. The parking area was quiet except for 2 other trucks and the distant whisper of wind through the pine trees. I climbed into the back of the cab, grateful for the comfortable-looking bunk that would be my bed for the next mandatory 8 hours. As I settled onto the mattress, I became aware of a subtle rhythmic sensation, almost like a gentle rocking motion. At first I attributed it to the truck's suspension settling after the long day's drive, or perhaps the wind moving the rig slightly on its springs. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized the rhythm was too regular, too consistent to be random movement. It felt almost like being on a ship in calm waters, with that slow, steady rise and fall that can lull you to sleep or make you seasick, depending on your disposition. I sat up and switched on the small reading light, mounted above the bunk. Everything looked normal in the warm yellow glow. The wood paneling was solid and properly secured, the carpet showed no signs of unusual wear, and the various storage compartments appeared exactly as they should. I pressed my hand against the mattress, trying to isolate the source of the movement, but as soon as I focused on it, the sensation seemed to stop. The moment I relaxed and closed my eyes, the gentle rocking resumed. It wasn't unpleasant, actually quite soothing, like being a child again in a parent's arms. Within minutes I drifted off into one of the most restful sleeps I'd had in years. The fourth day brought me through Utah's dramatic landscape and into Nevada's endless desert stretches. I felt remarkably refreshed, despite having slept in an unfamiliar bunk, and I found myself looking forward to another night in the surprisingly comfortable sleep. That evening I pulled into a truck stop outside of Reno, deciding to grab dinner and fuel before finding a quiet spot to park for the night. The truck stop was one of those sprawling complexes that cater to long-haul drivers, complete with restaurant, convenience store, showers, and a small arcade for entertainment. I spent a couple of hours there, enjoying a decent meal and stretching my legs before returning to the Freightliner. I found a spot in the back corner of the parking area, away from the main flow of traffic and the constant hum of refrigeration units. This time, however, I was more awake and alert, and I began to pay closer attention to the rhythm. It was remarkably consistent, about 60 to 70 beats per minute, I estimated. The realization sent a small chill down my spine, because that rhythm was unmistakably familiar. It matched almost exactly the resting heart rate of a healthy adult human being. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, and concentrated on the sensation. The mattress beneath me seemed to rise and fall ever so slightly, as if something large was breathing slowly and deeply underneath it. I reached over and placed my palm flat against the wall of the sleeper compartment, and I could swear I felt the same rhythmic pulsing through the paneling. My rational mind immediately began searching for logical explanation. Perhaps there was some kind of mechanical system in the truck that I wasn't familiar with, maybe an auxiliary power unit or hydraulic system that cycled at regular intervals. Some trucks had air ride suspension systems that occasionally adjusted themselves automatically. But even as I ran through these possibilities, I knew they didn't account for the organic quality of what I was experiencing. The rhythm was too natural, too much like something alive and breathing. I must have lain there for an hour, listening and feeling, before exhaustion finally overcame my unease. The steady pulse, whatever its source, proved as effective as a lullaby, and I slipped into another deep, dreamless sleep. I walked around the outside of the truck, examining every panel and component I could see. I popped the hood and studied the engine compartment, looking for any unusual equipment or modifications. I crawled underneath and checked the frame and suspension system. Everything appeared completely normal and standard for a truck of this model and age. Back in the cab, I searched through the glove compartment and door pockets, hoping to find some documentation about the truck's history or any special equipment. All I found were the usual registration papers, maintenance records, and a small notebook filled with trip logs from the previous driver. The handwriting was neat and precise, recording mileage, fuel purchases, and delivery information in methodical detail. It wasn't until I was flipping through the last few pages that I found anything unusual. Near the back of the notebook, in the same careful handwriting, were several entries that made my hands shake slightly as I read them. Can feel it breathing when I try to sleep. Almost comforting now. Day 18. Talked to Sarah about it. She thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. Day 24. Can't sleep anywhere else now. Regular beds feel dead and cold. Need the heartbeat. Day 31. Sarah filed for divorce. Says I care more about the truck than her. She doesn't understand. Day 46. Decided to retire. Can't keep doing this. The truck won't let me rest anywhere else. But staying out here forever isn't living. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks earlier. Pete says he has another driver lined up. Hope the new guy treats her right. She gets lonely. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at those words, and trying to make sense of what I was reading. The previous driver had clearly experienced the same phenomenon I was encountering, but his interpretation of it was far more disturbing than I wanted to consider. The Station That Mourns. From Jake Brennan. The CB crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding mountain passes of eastern Oregon, hauling a load of lumber toward Portland. It was well past midnight, and the fog had rolled in thick as cotton batting, reducing my world to the narrow cone of my headlights and the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, knew every curve and grade marker by heart, but tonight something felt different. The familiar comfort of the road had given way to an unsettling sense of isolation that seemed to press against the windows of my cab like living darkness. My radio had been acting up for the past hour, cycling through stations on its own, catching fragments of late-night talk shows and country music before dissolving back into white noise. I'd bought the rig used from a dealer in Sacramento, and the previous owner had left behind an old AM/FM radio that looked like it belonged in a truck from the 70s. Chrome and black plastic with analog dials that glowed amber in the dashboard light. The thing had character, and I'd grown fond of its quirky reception, the way it could pull in distant stations on clear nights when the atmospheric conditions were just right. But tonight, as the fog grew thicker and the mountain roads grew lonelier, the radio began behaving in ways that made the hair on my arms stand up. Instead of cycling through normal stations, it seemed to be searching for something specific, the tuner moving with deliberate precision, rather than the random drift I'd grown accustomed to. The static between stations had taken on an almost musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of human breathing. Around 2:30 in the morning, somewhere between Burns Junction and the Cascade foothills, the radio suddenly locked onto a frequency that shouldn't have existed. The static cleared with an audible pop, like a bubble bursting, and what came through the speakers made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. It was the sound of crying, not the dramatic sobbing of a radio drama or the manufactured emotion of a late-night advertisement, but genuine, heartbroken weeping that seemed to come from someplace impossibly deep and hollow. The crying was soft at first, barely audible above the engine noise, but it grew steadily clearer as I continued down the mountain. It was a woman's voice, I realized, though there was something ageless about the quality of her grief. She wept with the steady rhythm of someone who had been crying for a very long time, her sobs punctuated by occasional gasps that sounded like drowning. There were no words, no music, no station identification, just that endless, hopeless weeping that seemed to seep into the very air of my cab. I reached for the tuner, thinking I'd find another station, anything to escape that sound, but my hand froze halfway to the dial. Mixed in with the woman's tears, almost too faint to detect, I could hear other sound, the distant rumble of truck engines, the hiss of air brakes, the metallic ping of cooling metal, and underneath it all, so quiet I might have imagined it, the sound of rain on a windshield. But outside my cab, the night was dry, the fog hanging motionless in the still mountain air. The weeping continued as I descended toward the valley, and I found myself leaning forward in my seat, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. There was something familiar about the woman's voice, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. It tugged at a memory buried somewhere deep in my mind, like a half-remembered dream that dissolves when you try to focus on it. The sadness in her crying was so profound that it began to affect me physically. My chest grew tight, and my eyes started to water in sympathy. As the miles rolled by, other sounds began filtering through the static. Fragments of conversations, crackling and distorted as if transmitted from very far away. A man's voice saying something about schedules and delivery times. A dispatcher calling out route numbers and truck identifications. The familiar chatter of drivers keeping each other company through the long nights. But all of it was wrong somehow. layered with that same sense of distance and loss that permeated the woman's cry. Around 3:15, I passed a rest area that I'd stopped at countless times before, a small pull-off with picnic tables and a view of the valley below. But tonight, in the fog, it looked different. The picnic tables seemed weathered beyond their years, and the information kiosk that usually displayed maps and local attractions was dark and empty. More unsettling still, I could see the faint outline of a truck parked at the far end of the lot, its running lights creating dim halos in the mist. The truck looked like it had been there for a very long time, and now I could hear other voices joining hers, a chorus of grief that rose and fell like a lament. Men and women, young and old, all crying with the same inconsolable sorrow. Their voices blended together into something that was almost musical, a harmony of loss that made my skin crawl and my heart ache simultaneously. I tried switching off the radio, but it continued playing even after I'd turned the volume knob all the way down and punched the power button. The crying seemed to come from the dashboard itself now, from the very metal and plastic of the truck's interior. I rolled down the windows, thinking the night air might help, but the fog rolled in like searching fingers, and the weeping only grew louder, as if the entire mountain was mourning something terrible and ancient. They appeared gradually through the fog, parked along the shoulders and at the entrances to logging roads, their shapes barely visible in the murky darkness. Some looked modern, their chrome still gleaming, despite the moisture in the air. Others seemed decades older, their paint faded and their chrome pitted with rust. All of them sat silent and dark, no running lights, no signs of life. Just the shadowy hulks of abandoned rigs scattered along the mountainside like a graveyard of the highway. The radio voices were speaking more clearly now, and I began to catch fragments of conversations that chilled me to the bone. A woman calling out for her husband who was late getting home. A dispatcher trying to raise a driver who had missed his last check-in. A mother asking if anyone had seen her son, describing his truck, his route, his last known location. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a tapestry of worry and loss that seemed to stretch back decades. As I rounded a particularly sharp curve, my headlights swept across something that made me slam on the brakes, so hard that my load shifted and groaned behind me. There, standing at the edge of the fog, was a woman in a faded dress that might have been blue or gray in better light. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her arms were wrapped around herself as if she were cold. She was looking directly at my truck, and even through the murky air, I could see that her cheeks were wet with tears. I sat idling in the middle of the road, my heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the woman through my windshield. She didn't move, didn't wave for help or step out of the way. She just stood there crying, her mouth open in a silent wail that I somehow knew matched perfectly with the voice coming through my radio. The fog swirled around her like she was the center of it all, the source of the grief that had infected the entire mountain. Behind her, barely visible through the murk, I could see the shapes of other figures, men in work clothes and trucker caps, women in dresses from different eras, all standing motionless in the fog, all weeping for something I couldn't understand. And scattered among them, like monuments to loss, were more trucks, their shapes growing less distinct the deeper they receded into the mist, as if they were fading back through time itself. I gunned the engine and pulled around her, fighting the urge to look in my mirrors as I accelerated down the mountain. But the radio followed me, the weeping growing more intense, more desperate, as if my presence had stirred up emotions that had been dormant for years. New voices joined the chorus, and I began to hear my own CB handle mixed in with the static. Drivers calling out to Jake Brennan, asking for my location, wondering if I was all right. I drove harder than I should have on those fog-slicked curves, my load swaying dangerously as I took the turns too fast. Behind me I could feel rather than see the growing congregation of the lost, drawn by some force I didn't understand to follow me down the mountain. The Weeping Mile Marker. Ton. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio crackled with static as I downshifted my Peterbilt through the winding mountain pass, the familiar hum of the diesel engine providing its steady rhythm against the October night. I'd been driving these Wyoming routes for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to livestock feed, and I thought I knew every curve, every grade, every mile marker between Cheyenne and Casper like the back of my weathered hands. The dashboard clock read 2:37 in the morning, and a light drizzle had begun to kiss my windshield, creating tiny rivers that caught the amber glow of my running lights. Highway 220 stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional deer that would freeze in my headlights before bounding back into the pine darkness. My cargo of farm equipment was secured tight in the trailer behind me, the weight distribution perfect for these mountain roads that could turn treacherous without warning. The heater hummed softly, keeping the cab warm while outside the temperature hovered just above freezing, turning that gentle rain into a crystalline mist that clung to everything it touched. I was humming along to an old country song on the radio when I first noticed something unusual about mile marker. In all my years running this route, I'd passed that particular green sign hundreds of times, barely giving it a second glance as it reflected my headlights and disappeared into the rearview mirror. But tonight, as my high beam swept across its reflective surface, something seemed different. The white lettering appeared to shimmer, not with the usual steady reflection of my lights, but with an odd flickering quality that made me ease off the accelerator slightly. I told myself it was just the moisture in the air playing tricks with the light, creating some kind of optical illusion that my tired eyes were misinterpreting. After all, I'd been on the road for nearly 8 hours straight, and fatigue could make a driver see all sorts of things that weren't really there. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, and I was running on nothing but determination and the promise of a warm bed waiting for me in Casper. But as the mile marker disappeared behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen wasn't quite right. The rain began to fall more steadily, drumming against the cab roof with increasing intensity. I switched on the wipers, their rhythmic sweep creating a hypnotic pattern as they cleared the windshield every few seconds. The sound was soothing, almost meditative, and I found myself settling back into the comfortable routine of night driving, letting the truck's momentum carry us both through the darkness, while I monitored the road ahead for any signs of weather turning nasty. It was 20 minutes later when I encountered mile marker 27 again. But that didn't make sense, because Highway 220 runs straight through this section of mountains with no major intersections for miles in either direction. My GPS showed me still heading northwest, exactly where I should be, and the terrain looked right for this part of the route. Yet there it was again, that same green rectangular sign with its white reflective numbers, caught in the sweep of my headlight. This time I slowed the truck considerably, dropping down to about 30 miles per hour as I approached the marker. The rain had intensified, creating a steady percussion against the windshield that required the wipers to work harder, their rubber blades squeaking slightly against the glass. As I drew closer to the sign, my headlights illuminated something that made me press the brake pedal and bring the Peterbilt to a complete stop on the shoulder. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense that my exhausted mind was conjuring up, but literally weeping. Clear liquid was streaming down the face of the sign, flowing in rivulets that caught the light and created tiny streams running down to the metal post and pooling in the gravel below. At first glance it might have been rainwater, except that the tears, for that's what they unmistakably appeared to be, were flowing upward from the bottom of the sign before cascading down, defying both gravity and logic. I sat there in the cab, engine idling, windshield wipers maintaining their steady rhythm, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Perhaps there was some kind of spring or water source above the sign that I couldn't see in the darkness. Maybe the metal had expanded and contracted in the changing temperature, creating condensation that was flowing in unusual patterns. But even as I considered these possibilities, I knew they didn't account for what my eyes were clearly showing me. The weeping intensified as I watched, the streams of liquid becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. And then, impossibly, I began to hear even through the heavy glass of the cab, over the rumble of the diesel engine and the drumming of rain on the roof. I could detect a sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was a soft, mournful crying, like a child lost in the darkness, calling for someone who would never come. I reached for the CB radio, intending to call out to any other drivers who might be monitoring the emergency channel, but my hand froze halfway to the microphone. What would I say? That I'd found a road sign that was crying, that mile marker 27 was weeping like a mourner at a funeral. Even if another trucker believed me enough to come take a look, what if the phenomenon stopped the moment someone else arrived? I'd be known as the driver who'd lost his mind on Highway 220, seeing things that weren't there, hearing sounds that existed only in his imagination. Instead, I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled away from the shoulder, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, as the weeping mile marker disappeared once again into the darkness. The sound of crying seemed to follow me for several hundred yards, gradually fading until only the familiar sounds of the truck remained. I tried to convince myself that it had been an auditory hallucination, that my mind had somehow connected the visual strangeness of the weeping sign with an imagined sound that seemed to match what I was seeing. But 15 minutes later, when I encountered mile marker 27 for the third time, I knew that something far beyond my understanding was happening on this stretch of Wyoming highway. This time the sign wasn't just weeping, it was sobbing uncontrollably, the streams of tears flowing so heavily that they'd created puddles in the gravel that reflected my headlights like tiny mirrors. The crying was louder now, more anguished, and carried with it an overwhelming sense of loss that seemed to permeate the very air inside my cab. I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest, an echo of grief that wasn't my own, but somehow resonated with every loss I'd ever experienced. I stopped the truck again, this time leaving it in gear with my foot on the brake, ready to move quickly if necessary. The rain had become a downpour, hammering against the windshield with such intensity that the wipers could barely keep up. But through the blur of water and motion, I could see that the mile marker had begun to change. The numbers 27 were shifting, becoming less distinct, as if the metal itself was somehow softening or dissolving. And then, in a moment that I'll remember for the rest of my life, I saw her. She materialized slowly, like an image developing in an old photograph, taking shape beside the weeping mile marker. A young woman in a white dress that seemed to glow with its own inner light, her long dark hair plastered to her face by rain that didn't seem to be falling on her. She was looking directly at my truck, her eyes wide with an expression of desperate hope, her mouth moving as if she was trying to speak, but no sound was reaching me over the storm and the engine noise. She raised one pale hand toward my headlights, and I realized with a chill that ran straight through to my bones that she was the source of the weeping. The tears streaming down the mile marker were her tears, somehow transferred to the metal sign, as if it had become a conduit for her sorrow. She took a step toward the truck, then another, and with each movement forward the crying grew louder, more urgent, more filled with a longing that seemed to stretch across years or perhaps decades. The Peterbilt lurched forward, tires spinning briefly on the wet asphalt, before finding purchase and propelling us away from the impossible scene. In the side mirror I watched the glowing figure grow smaller, but she continued to reach toward the truck, even as the distance increased between us. The sound of weeping followed us for what seemed like miles, gradually fading but never quite disappearing entirely. I drove harder than I should have through that mountain storm, pushing the truck faster than was safe on the slick curves, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I'd encountered at mile mark. The cargo that breathes. From Jake Morrison. The Kenworth's dashboard clock read 2:17 in the morning, when I first felt the trailer shake behind me. Not the usual rattle you get from loose cargo or a pothole, this was different, deliberate, like something had shifted its weight from one side to the other, testing the confines of the 40-foot container I was hauling from Portland to Denver. I'd been driving freight for nearly 15 years, and in that time, I'd learned to read the subtle language my rig spoke through the steering wheel, the way vibrations traveled up through the cab to tell me stories about road conditions, tire pressure, and cargo distribution. This tremor that rolled through my seat at 217 was a word I'd never heard before. The manifest said I was carrying industrial machinery, hydraulic pumps and compressors bound for a mining operation outside Colorado Springs. Standard stuff, properly crated and secured according to the paperwork. The loading had been routine enough, handled by a crew at a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Portland, while I grabbed coffee and checked my route. Nothing unusual there, except maybe how quiet the loading crew had been. Usually those guys are full of jokes and complaints, but this bunch worked in near silence, communicating with hand signals and occasional grunt. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black river under the sparse glow of my headlights. I was making good time through the Oregon mountains, the engine humming its familiar diesel lullaby, when the second tremor hit. This one was stronger, accompanied by a low groaning sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the trailer. I eased off the throttle and checked my mirrors, but the taillights revealed nothing unusual, just the familiar white bulk of my container riding steady on its chest. Maybe it was the mountain air playing tricks, or the way sound carried differently at this altitude, but I could have sworn I heard something else mixed in with that groan, something almost organic, like a sigh or an exhale stretched long and low. The kind of sound a sleeping giant might make while dreaming restless dream. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of other rigs sitting dark and silent under the harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered with electrical insistence. The night air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the peaks that surrounded us like sleeping guardians. Everything looked secure, the customs locks undisturbed, the Department of Transportation placards properly displayed. I pressed my ear against the corrugated metal side and listened. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of cooling metal and the distant hum of the truck stop's generators. Then, just as I was about to pull away, I felt it, a subtle vibration against my cheek, rhythmic and slow, almost like a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be the size of freight containers. The logical part of my mind offered reasonable explanations. Hydraulic systems sometimes retained pressure, and metal components could shift and settle as temperature changes affected their containers. Pneumatic components might hold compressed air that could create unusual sounds as it escaped through tiny leaks or pressure relief valves. But standing there in the fluorescent washed darkness, with my face pressed against that metal wall, logic felt as thin as the mountain air. I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, telling myself that curiosity and fatigue were conspiring to turn routine cargo into something sinister. The heater kicked in with a reassuring mechanical wheeze, and I adjusted the CB radio to scan for chatter from other drivers. The channels were mostly quiet except for the occasional burst of static and a lonely voice somewhere out in the darkness, calling for anyone running eastbound on the interstate. The miles rolled by beneath my wheels as I descended from the mountains toward the high desert. The landscape outside my windows shifted from towering pines to sparse scrubland, painted silver by starlight. My cargo remained quiet for nearly an hour, lulling me into the comfortable rhythm of long-haul driving, the gentle sway of the cab, the steady throb of the diesel engine, the hypnotic march of mile markers in my peripheral vision. Then, somewhere between Burns and Ontario, the shaking started in earnest. It began as a subtle tremor, like driving over rumble strips, but the road beneath me was smooth asphalt. The vibration grew stronger, transmitted through the trailer hitch and up into the cab, until my coffee cup was dancing in its holder and the CB radio was chattering against its mouth. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and felt the whole rig sway as something substantial shifted its weight from side to side within the container. The movement had a pattern to it, a deliberate rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of an animal pacing in too small a cage. Left to right, pause, right to left, pause. The trailer rocked with each cycle, and I had to correct my steering to keep the rig centered in the lane. Whatever was back there, it was big enough to affect 40 tons of truck and cargo. I keyed the CB radio and called out to any drivers in the area, asking if anyone could take a look at my trailer as they passed. A gravelly voice responded from a driver running westbound, and a few minutes later I saw his headlights approaching in my mirror. As he pulled alongside in the passing lane, I heard his voice crackle through the radio. "Looks normal from here, driver. Containers riding steady. No obvious problems. You having handling issues?" But even as he spoke, I felt another massive shift from the cargo area, strong enough to push the trailer partially into the shoulder before I could correct. The CB fell silent for a moment, then the other driver's voice came back. "Different now." "Actually, partner, I'm not sure what I just saw. Looked like your whole trailer twisted for a second, like something inside was trying to turn it inside out. You might want to get that load checked when you hit the next town." The westbound driver's taillights disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone again with whatever was riding in my trailer. I considered stopping, maybe calling dispatch or even the local authorities, but the manifest was properly documented and sealed by customs. Opening the container without authorization would be a career-ending violation, and explaining that my cargo was apparently performing gymnastics would sound like the ravings of an overtired driver suffering from highway hypnosis. So I kept driving, maintaining steady speed and trying to ignore the increasingly violent shifts that rocked the trailer. The movements were definitely getting stronger and more frequent as the night wore on. By the time I crossed into Idaho, I had to grip the steering wheel with both hands to maintain control as something massive threw itself against the walls of its metal prison. The sound was the worst part, not just the metallic groaning of stressed container walls, but the other noises that accompanied each impact. Sounds that hydraulic pumps and industrial compressors had no business making. Sounds like frustrated breathing, like giant lungs working bellows made of flesh and tissue. Sometimes between the crashes and groans, I caught what might have been whispers. Voices too low and distorted to understand, but unmistakably purposeful, as if multiple speakers were coordinating their efforts in a language that predated human understanding. Dawn was still hours away when I reached the outskirts of Twin Falls, and the cargo had worked itself into what could only be described as a frenzy. The trailer was bucking and swaying like a thing possessed, and I had to drop my speed to 30 miles per hour to maintain any semblance of control. Other drivers were giving me a wide berth, and I didn't blame them. From the outside, my rig probably looked like it was having some kind of mechanical failure or carrying an improperly secured load that was about to break free and scatter across the interstate. I saw it happen in my passenger side mirror. The heavy metal doors that had been properly sealed and locked suddenly burst outward with tremendous force, the customs seals snapping like thread. But instead of cargo spilling onto the highway, I saw only darkness. Not the ordinary darkness of an unlit container, but something deeper and more substantial. Darkness that seemed to move with intention, that pressed against the edges of the open doorway like thick liquid testing the boundaries of its containment. The trailer immediately steadied, the violent rocking ceasing so abruptly that the sudden calm was almost more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what I'd witnessed. In my mirror I could see that the container doors had somehow closed themselves, appearing properly sealed once again despite what I'd just observed. The doors were indeed closed and locked, the customs seals intact and unbroken. The Department of Transportation placards were in their proper positions, and there was no sign that anything had been disturbed. But the air around the container felt different, somehow lighter, as if a tremendous pressure had been relieved. The engine that laughs at you. For Marcus Kowalski. The thing about driving the overnight hauls between Denver and Salt Lake City is that you start to know every sound your rig makes. After 15 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379, I could tell you the difference between a loose mud flap and a stone caught in the tread just by the rhythm it made against the asphalt. That's why when my engine started making a new sound 3 weeks ago, I noticed it right away, even though I probably should have ignored it like any sensible driver would. It started as just a wheeze, really, somewhere deep in the engine block during the long climb through the Rockies. Nothing dramatic, just a soft exhalation that seemed to come with every fourth or fifth compression cycle. My first thought was a minor vacuum leak. Maybe a cracked hose that I could patch up at the next truck stop. But as the miles rolled by and the night grew deeper around me, that wheeze began to change into something that made the hair on my neck stand up straight. 3 short puffs followed by a longer one, like the engine was trying to catch its breath after running up a flight of stairs. I turned down the CB radio and rolled up the windows, straining to listen more carefully to what was happening under the hood. That's when I first heard it clearly, cutting through the steady rumble of diesel combustion and the whine of the turbocharger. It would build slowly during acceleration, starting as those soft wheezes I'd noticed, then developing into a series of quick, staccato bursts that sounded disturbingly like chuckles. When I'd hit a long straightaway and settle into cruising speed, the laughter would fade back to that wheeze, as if whatever was causing it had worn itself out with amusement and was trying to catch its breath. Engines make all kinds of strange noises when they're breaking down. I'd heard diesels that sounded like they were crying, others that seemed to wheeze like old men, and one memorable Kenworth that made a sound exactly like a barking dog every time you downshifted. This was just another quirk of mechanical failure, nothing more than coincidence that it happened to sound like laughter. But as I descended into the Utah desert, with nothing but my headlights cutting through the absolute darkness of the highway, I started to realize that the timing of the laughter wasn't random. It would start up whenever I made a mistake, miss a gear change, and those chuckles would ripple through the engine bay. Take a curve too fast and have to brake harder than I should, and the laughter would build into what sounded almost like wheezing giggle. When I fumbled with my coffee cup and spilled half of it across my logbook, the engine burst into what I can only describe as mechanical hysterics. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, illuminated only by the pale glow of a 3/4 moon hanging low in the star-drunk sky. The landscape looked alien in the darkness, all twisted rock formations and scrub brush that cast weird shadows in my peripheral vision. This was the kind of country that played tricks on your mind during the deep night hours, where every distant light looked like it might be a UFO, and every strange rock formation seemed to be watching you pass. The engine was still running strong, despite the strange sounds. Oil pressure was good, temperature was normal, and all my gauges were reading exactly where they should. Whatever was causing the laughter wasn't affecting the actual performance of the truck. I had a delivery to make in Salt Lake City by 6 in the morning, and as long as the engine kept turning over, I could deal with weird noises. I'd think about changing lanes, and before I even put on my turn signal, a soft chuckle would rumble up from under the hood. When I reached for the radio to check in with dispatch, a series of quick laughs would start up, as if the engine found something amusing about my routine. Most unsettling of all, when my mind would wander to thoughts I'd rather keep private. Thoughts about my ex-wife or my mounting bills, or the growing certainty that I was getting too old for this job. The laughter would take on a mocking tone that made my skin crawl. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop outside of Provo, more to get away from the isolation of the highway than because I needed fuel. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a handful of other big rigs scattered across the acres of asphalt. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes every truck stop feel like a scene from a horror movie. I shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of refrigerated trailers. The quiet felt strange after hours of that mechanical laughter, like the absence of a sound you didn't realize was driving you crazy until it stopped. I climbed down from the cab and popped the hood, grabbing my flashlight to take a look at the engine. Belts were tight, hoses were secure, air filter was clean. I traced every line and connection I could see, looking for anything that might cause the strange sounds I'd been hearing. The engine bay was exactly as it should be, just a big diesel motor surrounded by the usual maze of pipes and wires and components that keep a modern truck running. Inside the truck stop, I bought coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, and tried to make conversation with the clerk, a tired-looking woman who seemed more interested in her phone than in talking to a driver with a strange problem. I described the sounds my engine was making, hoping she might have heard similar stories from other drivers, but she just shrugged and went back to scrolling through whatever was capturing her attention on the small screen. Back outside, I performed my routine pre-trip inspection, checking tires and lights, and all the safety equipment that regulations require. Everything was in perfect order. My truck was mechanically sound, legally compliant, and ready to complete the run to Salt Lake City. There was no reason not to fire it up and finish the job. When I turned the key, the engine caught immediately and settled into its normal idle. For a moment I felt foolish for being so concerned about what was obviously just an unusual but harmless mechanical quirk. Then I put the transmission in gear and gave it some throttle, and the laughter started again, louder and more pronounced than before, as if the brief rest had given it new energy. This time, though, the laughter seemed to be directed specifically at me. As I pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto the interstate, it built into what sounded unmistakably like mocking, derisive laughter. The kind of laugh you hear from bullies in a schoolyard, full of cruelty and contempt. The kind that makes you understand, with perfect clarity, that you're the butt of a joke you don't understand. I tried turning up the radio to drown it out, but the laughter seemed to adjust its volume to match, staying just loud enough to be clearly audible over whatever else was going on in the cab. I tried opening the windows, thinking that maybe wind noise would mask the sound, but that only made it more obvious, as if the laughter was coming not just from the engine, but from the very structure of the truck itself. The final stretch into Salt Lake City takes you through a series of canyons and mountain passes, winding roads that require attention and skill to navigate safely with a full trailer behind you. As I entered the first canyon, the laughter took on a different quality. Instead of mocking me, it began to sound excited, almost eager, like a child anticipating a favorite game. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. The engine wasn't just laughing at my mistakes or my private thoughts. It was laughing because it knew something I did, something about the road ahead, or about what was going to happen before I reached my destination. The laughter had the quality of someone who knows the punchline to a joke that hasn't been told yet. In the canyon, with steep walls rising on both sides and no place to pull over safely, I felt more trapped than I ever had in my years of driving. The laughter was building to a crescendo, becoming so loud that it seemed to vibrate through the entire truck. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, despite the cool mountain air. A vehicle was approaching fast from behind, much faster than was safe for these winding roads. As it drew closer, I could see it was another semi, running without any trailer and gaining on me rapidly. The weightless mile. From Marcus, the GPS had been acting up for the last 50 miles, flickering between satellite signals like a confused moth drawn to dying light bulbs. I'd been driving this route between Portland and Sacramento for nearly 8 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics in my trusty Peterbilt 37.9. But tonight, something felt different. The familiar hum of the diesel engine seemed muted somehow, as if the very air had grown thick and reluctant to carry sound. Rain drummed against my windshield in an irregular rhythm that my wipers couldn't quite match, creating streaks of distorted light from oncoming headlights that painted everything in an amber haze. The road stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, cutting through dense Oregon forest that pressed in on both sides like walls of living darkness. My CB radio crackled with the occasional exchange between other drivers, but even those familiar voices seemed distant tonight, fading in and out as if broadcast from another dimension entirely. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway, more for the ritual than the caffeine, trying to maintain some connection to the normal world. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, and in all my years driving this stretch, I'd never noticed it before. A simple reflective marker caught my headlights, indicating a rest area just ahead on the right. The sign itself was weathered and partially obscured by overgrown branches, reading something that looked like mile marker 77 rest area in faded blue letter. What struck me as odd was how the numbers seemed to shimmer slightly in my headlights, as if they weren't quite sitting flat against the metal surface. The windshield wipers squeaked with each pass, creating a hypnotic rhythm that was starting to make my eyelids heavy. I downshifted and pulled into the lay-by, my air brakes hissing softly as I brought the rig to a stop. The area was larger than I'd expected, easily big enough for 4 or 5 trucks, though mine was the only vehicle present. Overhead lighting was minimal, just 2 flickering sodium lamps that cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, creating more shadows than illumination. As I settled back in my seat and reached for my logbook, I noticed something peculiar. My pen, which I'd left on the dashboard, was floating. Not dramatically, not obviously, but definitely suspended about an inch above the surface where I'd placed it. I blinked hard, chalking it up to fatigue and the optical illusions created by the strange lighting outside. But when I reached for the pen, my hand moved slower than it should have, as if I were underwater, and when I grasped it, it felt oddly weightless in my finger. The coffee in my thermos was behaving strangely too. When I unscrewed the cap, instead of the usual splash and settle of liquid, the coffee formed perfect spherical droplets that drifted lazily in the air before slowly settling back down. The sight was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. I tried to convince myself that I was simply more tired than I'd realized, that my eyes were playing tricks after too many hours on the road, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside my cab windows, the rain wasn't falling in the normal sense. The droplets were descending so slowly, they seemed to hang in the air like suspended jewels, each one catching and refracting the light from the sodium lamps in tiny prismatic displays. When a few droplets hit my windshield, they didn't run down in rivulets as they should have. Instead, they clung to the glass in perfect dome shapes, as if surface tension had become the dominant force and gravity had simply lessened. I tried to check my CB radio for other drivers who might be experiencing similar phenomena, but the usual chatter had gone completely silent. The radio was functioning. I could hear the soft static between channels, but it was as if every other trucker on the highway had simply vanished. Even the distant rumble of traffic that should have been audible from the main road had faded to nothing. The only sounds were the irregular drumming of those impossibly slow raindrops and the gentle idle of my own engine. Opening the cab door required more effort than usual, as if the air itself had become viscous. When I climbed down from my seat, my boots touched the asphalt with almost no impact. Each step felt like walking on the surface of the moon. I could push off and remain airborne for several seconds before drifting gently back down. The sensation was initially exhilarating, like childhood dreams of flying, but it quickly transformed into something more sinister as the implications sank in. I could see the trees at the perimeter swaying normally in what must have been a considerable wind, but within the boundaries of the rest area, everything moved with dreamlike slowness. A plastic bag that had been caught by the breeze hung motionless in the air, about 10 feet off the ground, and when I reached up to touch it, it crumpled and reformed in slow motion. The crackling sound stretched out into an eerie whisper. I walked, or rather glided, toward the edge of the lay-by where it met the tree line. As I approached the boundary, I could feel the change like walking through an invisible curtain. One step, and I was in the zone of reduced gravity, where my movements were languid and dreamlike. Another step forward, and normal weight returned with such sudden force that I stumbled, my boots crunching normally on wet gravel and fallen leaves. Behind me in the lay-by, a leaf I'd kicked up during my experimentation was still slowly tumbling through the air, taking perhaps 30 seconds to complete a single rotation. The most disturbing part wasn't the physical impossibility of what I was witnessing, but how natural it felt once I accepted it. My body adapted quickly to the reduced gravity, and I found myself moving with an odd grace, pushing off gently from the ground to sail several feet with each step. There was something seductive about it, a freedom from the constant downward pull that defines human existence. For a few minutes I simply enjoyed the sensation, leaping higher and farther than should have been possible, feeling lighter than I had since childhood. But then I noticed the other vehicles. They were partially visible now that I was moving around the lay-by from different angles. Shadows within shadows that my eyes hadn't initially registered. A sedan from what looked like the 1970s sat at the far end of the rest area, its occupants still inside but motionless, suspended in their seats like mannequins. A motorcycle leaned against nothing at all, its kickstand several inches above the ground, held in place by nothing but the altered physics of this impossible place. Their eyes were open, staring straight ahead with expressions of mild curiosity rather than fear. They were floating slightly in their seats, seatbelts loose around their weightless bodies, and they turned their heads slowly to watch me approach. When the driver raised his hand in a gentle wave, the gesture took nearly 10 seconds to complete, his arm moving through the air like it was filled with honey. That's when I realized the true horror of the lay-by. It wasn't just a zone of reduced gravity, it was a trap. These people had been here for decades, caught in the same web of impossible physics that was now affecting me. Their perception of time stretched out so that minutes felt like hours, hours like days. They were conscious, aware, but locked in a state of perpetual slow motion, watching the world beyond the lay-by's boundaries speed past at what must seem like impossible velocity. Each step launched me too high, too far, and I found myself floating helplessly for seconds at a time before drifting back toward the ground. Panic made my movements even more erratic, and I began to bounce and tumble rather than make any real progress. The sodium lamps flickered overhead, and in their unstable light, I could see more vehicles that had been hidden in the shadows. A delivery van, an old pickup truck, even what appeared to be a horse-drawn wagon from a much earlier era. My truck seemed impossibly far away, though it couldn't have been more than 50 yards. Each leap in its direction felt like swimming through increasingly thick air, and I began to suspect that the gravitational anomaly was growing stronger. Or perhaps I was being drawn deeper into its influence. The rain continued its surreal slow-motion descent around me, and I noticed that my own breathing had begun to slow as well, each inhalation taking longer than it should. The Breathing Canvas, from Jake Hendricks. The night I picked up that load in Bakersfield, the dispatcher warned me the trailer had been sitting in their yard for 3 weeks. Something about paperwork delays and insurance claims. Though he didn't say much more than that. The manifest listed machine parts bound for a factory in Ohio. Nothing unusual, but when I hooked up to that 53-footer, I noticed the tarp covering the load seemed newer than everything else about the rig. Deep blue canvas stretched tight as a drumhead over whatever was beneath it, secured with more tie-down straps than I'd ever seen on a single load. I've been pulling freight for 15 years, and you develop instincts about these things. The way the trailer settled on its springs when I raised the landing gear told me the weight distribution was off. Whatever was under that tarp wasn't machine parts, at least not the kind I was used to hauling. But the bills of lading were in order, the seals were intact, and the pay was better than usual. In this business you learn not to ask too many questions when the money's right. Interstate 40 stretched ahead like a ribbon of black velvet, punctuated by the occasional glow of a truck stop or the distant lights of some desert town. My CB crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, complaints about DOT inspections and fuel prices, the comfortable white noise of the road. The engine hummed its familiar rhythm, a Detroit diesel's lullaby that had carried me across millions of miles over the year. It was somewhere past Flagstaff, Arizona, when I first noticed the sound, a soft rhythmic creaking from behind me, like leather stretching under pressure. At first I figured it was just the trailer settling as we climbed through the mountain passes. But the sound persisted even on the flat stretches. Every few minutes, that same gentle groan would drift forward through the sleeper berth, barely audible over the engine noise, but somehow impossible to ignore. The tarp appeared to be moving, rising and falling in a slow, deliberate pattern, not fluttering in the wind like you'd expect, but expanding and contracting as if the trailer itself was breathing. I told myself it was an optical illusion, Maybe heat shimmer from the exhaust pipe, or the way the running lights cast shadows across the canvas. But as I watched, the movement became more pronounced, more rhythmic, like the steady rise and fall of lungs drawing air. I pulled into a rest area near Winslow to check the load, grabbing my flashlight from the cab and walking around to the back of the trailer. The tie-down straps were still secure, but they seemed tighter than before, cutting deep grooves into the blue canvas. When I pressed my hand against the tarp, it felt warm to the touch despite the cool desert air, and I could swear I felt a pulse beneath the surface, slow and steady like a giant heartbeat. The shipping papers were still in order, but reading them again under the fluorescent lights of the rest area, I noticed details I'd missed before. The shipper's address led to an industrial complex that had been demolished 6 months ago, according to the date stamp on the permits. The consignee was listed as a company I couldn't find in any directory, and the product codes didn't match anything in my freight classification guide. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make this load appear legitimate, while hiding what it really was. Back on the road, the sounds from the trailer grew more frequent and varied. Along with the creaking of the tarp, I began to hear what sounded like metal groaning under stress, as if whatever was underneath was pressing outward with increasing force. The trailer's handling changed too, developing a subtle sway that hadn't been there before, like the load was shifting despite being properly secured. Every time I hit a bump or took a curve, the whole rig would shudder in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The CB radio started acting up around midnight, picking up fragments of conversations that didn't quite make sense. Voices talking about shipments that were overdue, cargo that had gone missing, drivers who'd taken loads and never arrived at their destination. Static would cut in and out, turning words into whispers that seemed to come from somewhere much closer than the radio speaker. I switched channels, but the voices followed me, growing clearer and more urgent as the night wore on. A big Peterbilt running dark, no running lights or identification, pulling a trailer identical to mine. The same deep blue tarp, the same excessive number of tie-down straps, the same rhythmic movement that suggested something alive beneath the canvas. The truck paced me for miles, staying exactly parallel in the left lane, never passing, never falling behind. When I sped up, it matched my speed. When I slowed down, it slowed with me. I tried raising the driver on the radio, calling out on channel 19, but got no response. The cab of the Peterbilt was dark, no interior lights, no glow from the dashboard. I couldn't even tell if there was anyone behind the wheel. The truck just maintained its position beside me like a ghost ship sailing through an ocean of asphalt and darkness. After 20 minutes of this synchronized driving, the Peterbilt suddenly accelerated and disappeared into the distance, leaving me alone with my questions and the increasingly active cargo behind me. Small rips at first, appearing along the stress points where the straps pulled tightest, but instead of relieving the pressure, each tear seemed to make the tarp contract even more, as if it were trying to contain something that was growing larger by the hour. The canvas pulled taut as piano wire, straining against the tie-downs with a force that made the trailer groan and flex. I could see the outline of whatever was underneath becoming more defined, pushing against the tarp like something trying to break free. The engine began to labor, working harder to maintain highway speed despite being on level ground. The fuel gauge dropped faster than it should have, as if the truck was pulling twice its normal load. When I checked the mirrors again, the trailer appeared longer than before, stretching back into the darkness beyond the reach of my running lights. The whole rig felt different, heavier and more cumbersome, like I was hauling something that defied the normal laws of physics. I made a decision to pull off at the next truck stop, called dispatch, and refuse the load. Whatever was under that tarp wasn't worth the money they were paying me to haul it. But as I reached for the turn signal, the steering wheel locked up. The truck continued straight ahead, maintaining speed, as if something else had taken control. The brakes wouldn't respond either, the pedal solid as concrete under my foot. I was trapped in my own cab, a passenger in a vehicle I could no longer command. The tarp finally gave way with a sound like thunder, shredding along its entire length and revealing what lay beneath. But instead of machine parts or any kind of conventional cargo, I saw only darkness. Not empty space, but a writhing, living darkness that seemed to absorb the light from my running lamps and mirrors. It moved with purpose, flowing like liquid shadow, while maintaining a density that suggested substance. Tendrils of this darkness began to creep forward along the trailer, reaching toward the cab with an intelligence that made my blood freeze. Drivers who'd picked up mysterious loads, trailers that changed their contents during transport, cargo that wasn't cargo at all but something else entirely. Their voices overlapped and distorted, creating a chorus of warning and desperation that filled the cab with noise. Some of the voices sounded like they'd been talking for years, describing trips that never ended, roads that led nowhere, loads that could never be delivered because they weren't meant for any earthly destination. The darkness had almost reached the back of the cab when I remembered the emergency brake. A manual system, independent of the hydraulics, operated by a cable that couldn't be overridden by whatever force had taken control of the truck. I yanked the handle with everything I had, and the trailer brakes locked up, sending the rig into a controlled jackknife that brought us to a sliding stop on the shoulder of the highway. The sudden halt threw the darkness backward, and for a moment, the tarp reformed itself, covering the cargo as if nothing had happened. The steering wheel unlocked, the engine returned to its normal idle, and the CB radio fell silent. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything returned to normal except for the knowledge of what I'd seen and felt. The shipping papers in my logbook had changed too, now showing a legitimate load of machine parts bound for a real company, complete with proper documentation and tracking number. I unhooked from that trailer and left it sitting on the shoulder of Interstate 40, calling dispatch to report a mechanical problem that would require another driver to complete the delivery. The dead frequency. From Marcus Nighthawk Thompson. You spend enough years hauling freight across this country's endless highways, and you learn that the road has its own language. Every trucker knows the CB channels like a preacher knows his psalms. Channel 9 for emergencies, 19 for the chatter, 21 for the road conditions. But there's one channel we don't talk about much, one that most drivers pretend doesn't exist. Channel 0. The dead frequency. I'd been running the Interstate 80 corridor for near 15 years when I first heard about Channel 0 from an old-timer named Diesel Dan at a truck stop outside Omaha. Dan was one of those weathered drivers who'd been pulling loads since before GPS units and electronic logs, back when navigation meant a dog-eared atlas and intuition. He was nursing black coffee at 3 in the morning, his hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. The fluorescent lights above our booth flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across his deeply lined face. Outside, Nebraska rain drummed against the diner windows, with a steady rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. I told him I hadn't, that my CB only went down to Channel 1. Most rigs were the same way. Dan nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer, then pulled out an old Cobra 29 radio from a worn canvas bag. The thing looked ancient, all scratched chrome and yellowed plastic, but when he powered it on, it hummed with surprising clarity. "This old girl goes lower," he said, adjusting the channel selector with deliberate care. Sometimes the radio waves pick up things they shouldn't, signals that bounce around in the atmosphere for years, decades even, messages that never found their destination. He paused, studying my face in the sickly diner light. Channel 0 is where the lost transmissions end up, the final calls from drivers who never made it home. I laughed it off. Figured Dan was spinning trucker folklore to pass the time, but something in his expression, a haunted quality in those gray eyes, made me uncomfortable. When he offered to sell me the radio for $200, I found myself agreeing, though I couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the rain seemed to intensify every time he mentioned Channel 0, as if the storm itself was listening. 3 weeks later, I was pulling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Cleveland, driving through the Nevada desert in the small hours before dawn. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into darkness beyond my headlight beam. My usual CB crackled with the occasional exchange between night drivers, but the conversations felt distant and hollow in the vast emptiness surrounding me. That's when I remembered Dan's radio, still in its canvas bag behind my sleeper berth. The rational part of my mind insisted it was foolish, but the desert has a way of making rational thoughts feel small and inadequate. I installed the Cobra 29 with practiced efficiency, connecting the power leads and antenna cable while my Peterbilt maintained steady speed on cruise control. The radio came alive with a warm electronic hum that seemed somehow different from modern equipment, richer somehow, like the difference between vinyl records and digital music. I dialed through the familiar channels, noting how clearly the old radio received even weak signals. Channel 19 buzzed with a conversation between two drivers, comparing fuel prices in Reno. Channel 21 carried a weather update warning of fog rolling into the Central Valley. Then I rotated the channel selector one more click counterclockwise, and the display showed a simple 0. Silence filled my cab, but it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pregnant with possibility. Static whispered through my speakers like wind through dry grass, and beneath that subtle white noise, I could almost detect something else. A rhythm perhaps, or the ghost of distant voices. Miles passed in hypnotic succession as I listened to Channel Zero's peculiar emptiness. The desert began to give way to rolling hills, and my fuel gauge suggested a stop in Winnemucca. I was reaching to switch back to Channel 19 when the silence broke. Breaker, breaker. This is Road Dog eastbound on Interstate 80, mile marker 9. The voice crackled through my speakers with the hollow quality of old recordings, each word tinged with growing desperation. I got me a situation here. Need immediate assistance. Immediate assistance. We grabbed my microphone instinctively. Mile marker 19.4 was only 30 miles ahead. Road Dog, this is Nighthawk. I'm westbound, about 20 minutes from your 20. What's your situation? But the voice continued as if he hadn't heard me. My engine's overheating. Temperature gauge is climbing fast. I can see steam starting to rise from under the hood. There's no shoulder here, just a steep drop-off to the right and rock wall to the left. I tried again. Road Dog, you copy Nighthawk? What's your truck and trailer description? I'm pulling a 40-foot refrigerated trailer. White Freightliner cab, the voice responded, but again it felt like he was speaking past me, rather than to me. The steam's getting thicker now. I can barely see the road ahead. This is Road Dog requesting emergency assistance. Interstate 80 eastbound, mile marker 9. The transmission cut to static, leaving me alone with the sound of my diesel engine and the whisper of wind around my cab. I pushed my Peterbilt harder, watching my speedometer climb as I approached mile marker 9. The highway curved through a narrow canyon exactly as Road Dog had described, with steep granite walls rising on the left and a dangerous drop-off to the right. But the road was empty. No white Freightliner, no disabled truck, no emergency vehicles, just empty asphalt gleaming in my headlights and the dark silhouettes of canyon walls against the star-filled sky. I pulled onto the next available shoulder and grabbed my CB microphone. Breaker for Road Dog, white Freightliner eastbound. You copy. Drive. Channel 0 remained silent except for its persistent static whisper. Dig at me. Over the following weeks, I found myself drawn repeatedly to that dead frequency. The transmissions came irregularly, always different voices, always desperate situations. There was Moondog, whose trailer brakes had locked up during a Wyoming blizzard. Sweet Caroline, whose power steering had failed on a mountain pass in Colorado. Iron Horse, reporting a tire blowout in construction zone traffic. Each time, I would race to their reported locations, driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully understand. And each time, I found nothing but empty highway. The breakthrough came on a foggy November night in eastern Pennsylvania. I was hauling steel coils from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia when Channel Zero crackled to life with a familiar voice. Mayday, Mayday, this is Diesel Dan eastbound. On Interstate 76, mile marker. The transmission quality was identical to the others, that hollow, distant sound like voices echoing in deep caves. I got brake failure on the downgrade. Speed climbing past 70. Can't slow this rig down. My blood turned cold. Dan's voice carried the same desperate edge I'd heard from all the others, but this was the man who'd sold me the radio, who'd first told me about Channel Zero. Mile marker 312 was less than 10 miles ahead, where Interstate 76 descended through steep hills toward Valley Forge. I floored my accelerator, pushing my Peterbilt beyond safe speeds. As I raced through the fog-shrouded highway, the mile markers flashed past in my peripheral vision. 3-8, my headlights carved tunnels through the thick mist, revealing glimpses of guardrails and reflective road markers. At mile marker 312, I found him. A jackknifed semi-trailer blocked both eastbound lanes. Its cab twisted at an unnatural angle against the concrete median barrier. The trailer had separated and rolled, steel cargo scattered across the asphalt like giant coins. Emergency vehicles surrounded the wreckage, their red and blue lights painting the fog in alternating colors. It pulled my rig onto the shoulder and approached the nearest state trooper, my legs unsteady beneath me. The officer looked exhausted, his uniform wrinkled and stained. "Terrible accident," he said, following my gaze toward the wreckage. "Driver didn't make it. Brake failure on the downgrade. Witnesses said he was honking his horn and flashing his lights, trying to warn other vehicles." I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. The trooper consulted his notebook. Call came in at 11:47 p.m. on November 5th. He paused, studying my expression. "That was 3 years ago. We just finished clearing the last of the debris tonight. The route that writes back. From Marcus C. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you start to know every mile marker, every pothole, every faded billboard like they're old friends. Interstate 47 between Millbrook and Cedar Falls had become as familiar to me as my own reflection, worn smooth by countless nights of hauling freight through its gentle curves and rolling hills. My Kenworth T680 hummed its steady diesel lullaby as we moved through the Missouri countryside, headlights cutting through the thick October fog that seemed to rise from the earth itself like sleepy breath. I'd been running this particular stretch since 2008, back when the economy crashed and long-haul jobs were harder to come by. The route wasn't glamorous, mostly agricultural equipment and construction materials, but it was reliable work that paid the bills and kept me moving. Late-night runs were my preference anyway, less traffic and something peaceful about having the highway mostly to yourself, just you and the occasional passing trucker who'd flash his lights in that universal greeting we all understood. It was approaching midnight when I first noticed something different about mile marker 20. Nothing dramatic, mind you, just a small detail that seemed off in a way I couldn't quite place. The marker itself looked the same as always, that familiar green rectangle with white lettering, but there seemed to be additional text beneath the number. I squinted through the windshield as my headlights swept past, trying to make out what looked like smaller writing below the usual highway designation. The fog wasn't helping my visibility, thick enough that I had to slow down to about 50 miles per hour and keep my low beams on to avoid creating a wall of reflected light. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but the bitter taste still lingered in my mouth as I tried to convince myself I was seeing things. 20 minutes later I passed mile marker 28, and there it was again. Definitely additional text, small and precise, tucked underneath the main number. This time I caught what looked like actual words, though I couldn't make them out clearly enough to understand their meaning. The letters appeared to be the same reflective material as the main marker, but they seemed newer somehow, less weathered by years of highway exposure and seasonal changes. I reached for my CB handset, thinking I'd ask if any other drivers had noticed anything unusual along this stretch, but something made me hesitate. The radio had gone quiet, no more distant chatter, just the soft static that meant I was alone on the frequency. My engine maintained its steady rhythm, but even that familiar sound seemed muffled by the fog that pressed against my windows like curious fingers. Mile marker 29 came into view, and I slowed down even more, determined to read whatever message had been added to these signs. The fog seemed to part just enough as I approached, and I could clearly see additional text that read, "Marcus drives too fast through here." My foot instinctively moved to the brake pedal, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through my door seals. The logical part of my mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Vandalism, maybe, though I'd never seen highway department reflective lettering used for graffiti. Perhaps some kind of electronic display I'd never noticed before, though these were standard mile markers that hadn't been updated in decades. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, knew every sign and landmark, and I was absolutely certain these messages hadn't been there before tonight. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I continued forward, the fog seeming to thin and thicken in rhythmic patterns that reminded me of breathing. The next mile marker appeared sooner than expected, as if the distance between them had somehow shortened. Marker 130 bore the message, "Marcus should call home more often," and I felt my stomach clench with an uncomfortable recognition of truth. I hadn't called my sister in 3 weeks, despite promising to check in regularly after our mother's funeral last spring. Work had kept me busy, deadlines and delivery schedules creating convenient excuses for avoiding conversations that might turn to grief and family obligations. I wasn't ready to discuss. The highway knew things it shouldn't know, secrets that belonged in late-night phone calls and quiet kitchen conversations, not displayed on roadside markers in the middle of nowhere, Missouri. The mile markers continued their impossible commentary on my life with each passing sign. Marcus worries about his blood pressure but won't see a doctor. Marcus keeps his father's watch in the glove compartment. Marcus dreams about the accident on highway. Each message was perfectly accurate. Revelations I'd shared with no one. Private thoughts and fears I barely acknowledged to myself during long hours behind the wheel. My CB radio suddenly burst to life with my own voice, clear and unmistakable, saying things I'd never spoken aloud. Conversations with dispatch, arguments with my ex-wife, confessions I'd made only to the empty cab of my truck during lonely stretches of highway. The voice was definitely mine, but I was hearing thoughts and words that had never left my mind, intimate details of a life I thought I'd kept private. The fog began to take shapes around my truck, forming figures that walked alongside the road at exactly my speed. They looked like people I'd known, drivers who'd retired or died, family members I'd lost touch with over the years. They moved with the peculiar gait of highway pedestrians, always keeping pace no matter how I adjusted my speed, always staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision, where I couldn't look at them directly. Mile marker the 135 simply read, "Marcus needs to stop," and I realized I'd been driving for what felt like hours without reaching Cedar Falls. The dashboard clock showed impossible times that changed as I watched, numbers shifting and rearranging themselves like they couldn't decide what time it actually was. My fuel gauge remained steady despite the distance I'd traveled, and my odometer seemed to be counting backwards, subtracting miles instead of adding them. The road ahead began to curve in ways I didn't remember, gentle turns becoming tighter spirals that seemed to fold back on themselves. I caught glimpses of my own taillights in the distance, red dots that appeared and disappeared in the fog like distant stars. The asphalt beneath my tires felt different, softer somehow, with a texture that reminded me more of skin than concrete. My engine started to cough, a rough, irregular rhythm that I'd never heard from the reliable diesel that had carried me across hundreds of thousands of miles. The dashboard lights flickered, gauges jumping erratically as if the truck itself was becoming confused about its basic function. The steering wheel felt warm under my hands, almost feverish, and I could swear I felt a pulse beating through the vinyl covering. The mile markers were coming faster now, appearing every few hundred yards instead of at proper mile interval. Each one carried messages that cut deeper than the last, observations about choices I'd made, opportunities I'd missed, words I should have spoken but never did. Marcus left when things got hard. Marcus pretends he doesn't get lonely. Marcus knows he's lost but won't ask for direction. I tried to radio for help, but the CB only broadcast my own voice back to me, a distorted echo that spoke my thoughts before I could think them. The fog pressed closer to my windows, and I could see faces in the swirling gray, expressions of disappointment and concern that belonged to everyone I'd ever let down. The road began to slope downward at an angle that seemed impossible, descending into darkness that my headlights couldn't penetrate. The mile markers were everywhere now, sprouting from the roadside like metallic flowers, each one carrying fragments of my life story, pieces of myself I'd scattered across years of highway travel. The fog lifted, revealing the familiar straight stretch of Interstate 47 that I knew so well. Mile marker 142 appeared in my headlights, perfectly ordinary, bearing no messages or additional text. My radio crackled back to life with normal trucker chatter, and my dashboard showed reasonable numbers that matched my expectation. The other drivers there seemed perfectly normal, complaining about weather and traffic in the usual way, showing no signs that anything unusual had happened on the highway tonight. Small observations about my driving habits, personal reminders and questions about my life that seemed to be written in my own handwriting. The paper felt warm to the touch, and the ink shimmered slightly in the fluorescent lights of the truck stop-off. I still drive Interstate 47, though I've requested different schedule rotations when possible. Sometimes on foggy nights when the highway feels too quiet, I catch glimpses of additional text on the mile marker. Brief messages that seem almost friendly now, like notes from someone who knows me well and wants me to remember things I might otherwise forget. The engine's fury. From Marcus Holloway. The first thing you learn about driving an 18-wheeler cross-country is that your truck becomes more than just a machine. It becomes your partner, your home, your lifeline on those endless ribbons of asphalt that stretch between nowhere and somewhere else. I've been hauling freight for nearly 20 years now, and I thought I knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk that a big rig could throw at me. But there are some things that can't be explained by worn gaskets or loose bolts. Some problems that no amount of mechanical know-how can fix. It started 3 weeks ago, when I picked up my new ride from the depot in Bakersfield. She was a beauty. I'll give her that. A midnight blue Peterbilt 309, with enough chrome to blind you in broad daylight, and an extended cab that felt more spacious than my apartment back in Phoenix. The previous driver had left suddenly, according to the dispatcher, something about a family emergency that couldn't wait. They were eager to get her back on the road, and I was between trucks after my old Kenworth had finally given up the ghost outside of Tucumcari. The paperwork was clean, the inspection thorough, and the engine purr was as smooth as silk when I fired her up for the first time. Everything seemed perfect as I pulled out of the yard with a load of electronics bound for Memphis. The cab smelled faintly of pine air freshener, and that particular blend of diesel and worn leather that every long-haul trucker knows by heart. The radio crackled to life with classic rock, and I settled in for what I expected to be a routine run across the southern state. The first few days passed without incident. The Peterbilt handled like a dream, her engine humming contentedly as we ate up the miles through California's Central Valley and into the desert expanses of Arizona and New Mexico. The air conditioning kept the cab cool, despite the brutal August heat, and the sleeper berth was more comfortable than I'd expected. I made good time, keeping within the speed limits and taking my mandatory rest breaks as required by law. It wasn't until somewhere outside of Amarillo, Texas, that I first noticed something unusual. I was cruising along Interstate 40 in the pre-dawn darkness, the highway stretching empty ahead of me like a black river under the star-scattered sky. The engine had been running smooth as always, that familiar diesel rhythm that becomes like a heartbeat after a while. But suddenly there was something else, a subtle rattling that seemed to come from somewhere up front, around the hood area. At first I dismissed it as road vibration, maybe a loose piece of trim that needed tightening. The sound was barely perceptible over the engine noise and the whisper of wind around the cab. But as the miles rolled by, it seemed to grow more pronounced, more insistent. It wasn't the steady rattle of a loose bolt or the irregular knock of engine trouble. This was different, rhythmic but angry, like something trapped and trying to get out. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Oklahoma City as the sun was climbing into a cloudless sky, the asphalt already beginning to shimmer with heat waves. I popped the hood and spent a good hour going over every visible component, checking bolts, examining hoses, looking for any obvious source of the rattling I'd been hearing. Everything appeared tight and properly secured. The engine oil was clean, the coolant levels perfect, the belts properly tensioned. By all appearances, the truck was in excellent mechanical condition. But as I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, the rattling was still there, now unmistakably coming from somewhere beneath that pristine blue hood. It seemed louder now, more agitated, as if my inspection had somehow disturbed whatever was causing it. I tried adjusting my driving style, thinking maybe it was related to engine RPM or road speed, but the sound persisted regardless of how I handled the throttle. Where before I'd enjoyed the solitude of the highway, the endless parade of landscape rolling past my windows, now I found myself hyper-aware of every sound the truck made. The rattling had become a constant companion, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers, other times growing loud enough that I could feel it vibrating through the steering wheel. It was worse during the quiet hours of early morning, when traffic was light and the world seemed wrapped in that peculiar stillness that comes just before dawn. I tried wearing earplugs during my driving shifts, but the vibration seemed to travel through the truck's frame and into my bones. Sleep became difficult in the narrow confines of the sleeper berth. As the rattling continued even when the engine was shut down, a faint but persistent sound like fingernails drumming against metal. I spent another morning at a truck stop, this time crawling underneath the rig with a flashlight, checking every bracket, every mounting point, every piece of hardware I could reach. I even paid a mechanic at the stop to take a look, but he came up as empty-handed as I had. According to every diagnostic test and visual inspection, the truck was running perfectly. The return trip to California was when things really began to escalate. I'd picked up a load of auto parts in Nashville, and I was making good time across Arkansas when the character of the rattling began to change. It was no longer just a mechanical sound. There seemed to be patterns to it now, rhythms that reminded me uncomfortably of communication attempts. Sometimes it would tap out rapid staccatos like Morse code. Other times it would settle into slow, deliberate beats like a heart monitor. The most unnerving part was how it seemed to respond to my emotions. When I was calm and focused on driving, the rattling would subside to a background murmur. But whenever I became frustrated or anxious, whenever I started thinking too hard about what might be causing it, the sound would intensify dramatically. It was as if something under that hood was feeding off my tension, growing stronger as my peace of mind deteriorated. I started talking to other drivers at truck stops, carefully probing to see if anyone else had experienced similar problems. Most just shrugged and offered suggestions about engine mounts or exhaust system issues. But one grizzled veteran, a man named Earl, who'd been driving for 30-some years, pulled me aside after hearing my description. "You driving that blue Pete that used to belong to Danny Kowalski?" he asked, his weathered face creased with concern. When I nodded, he whistled low and shook his head. "That boy didn't leave for no family emergency, son. Word is he just up and abandoned that truck at a rest area outside of Flagstaff. Security found him 3 days later, walking along the shoulder of the interstate 50 miles away, mumbling to himself and refusing to go anywhere near that rig." Earl's words followed me as I continued west, the rattling under the hood seeming to grow more aggressive with each passing mile. The sound had definitely taken on an almost organic quality now, rising and falling like labored breathing, punctuated by sharp metallic strikes that made me flinch. I began to dread the quiet stretches of highway, preferring heavy traffic where the noise of other vehicles could provide some relief from my truck's increasingly hostile soundtrack. It was somewhere in the emptiness of New Mexico, on a stretch of Interstate 40 that runs straight as an arrow through high desert country, that I finally understood I wasn't dealing with a mechanical problem. I was fighting a headwind, pushing hard to maintain highway speed, when the rattling suddenly stopped completely. The silence was so abrupt and unexpected that I actually let off the throttle, thinking the engine had quit. It was just the rattling that had ceased, leaving behind a quiet that felt somehow ominous. I drove in that unnatural silence for maybe 10 miles, gradually allowing myself to hope that whatever had been plaguing the truck had finally resolved itself. Then, without warning, the entire hood began to shake violently, as if something massive was thrashing around beneath it. The whole front end of the truck shuddered and bucked, making the steering wheel jerk in my hand. The headlights flickered erratically, throwing crazy shadows across the desert landscape. I could hear metal groaning and straining, sounds that no truck should ever make. I managed to wrestle the rig to a stop on the shoulder, my hands shaking as I set the parking brake and shut down the engine. But even with the diesel silent, the hood continued to rattle and shake for another full minute before gradually settling back into stillness. I sat in the cab for a long time after that, listening to my own rapid heartbeat and watching the empty highway stretch away into the darkness on both sides. No loose components, no signs of the violent motion I'd witnessed. The Carousel of Mile Marker 47. From Jake Sullivan. The first thing any long-haul trucker learns is to trust their instincts. And mine were screaming that something was wrong with that rest stop the moment I saw the Ferris wheel spinning lazily against the October sky. I'd been driving this route between Portland and Sacramento for nearly 15 years, and I could swear, on my grandmother's grave, that there had never been an amusement park at mile marker 47. Yet there it stood, bathed in the amber glow of my headlights, as if it had always belonged in that patch of California scrubland. The rain had been coming down steady for the past 2 hours, turning my windshield into a canvas of streaking droplets that caught and scattered the light from passing cars. My wipers beat their rhythmic song against the glass, while the familiar rumble of my Kenworth's engine provided a comforting bass note beneath it all. I'd been planning to push through to Bakersfield before stopping for the night, but the fuel gauge was dipping toward empty, and the next truck stop wasn't for another 60 miles. When I spotted the exit sign for the rest area, I figured it was worth checking out, even though I couldn't remember it being there on my last run through this stretch of highway just 2 weeks prior. The off-ramp curved gently to the right, and as I downshifted and let the engine brake slow my rig, I got my first clear look at the place. It wasn't much to speak of, just a small parking area with maybe a dozen spaces, flanked by a single-story building that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1950s. The neon sign above the entrance flickered sporadically, casting intermittent pools of pink and blue light across the wet asphalt. But it was the carnival ride behind the building that caught and held my attention, that old-fashioned Ferris wheel turning slowly, steadily, despite the fact that I couldn't see anyone operating it or riding in its weathered gondola. I pulled my truck into one of the larger spaces and killed the engine, letting the sudden silence settle around me like a heavy blanket. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the cab's roof, and through the sound I could hear something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warmth inside the truck. It was music, faint and tinny, the kind that might drift from a carousel or an old carnival game. The melody was hauntingly familiar, something from childhood perhaps, but I couldn't quite place it. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he might have been there since the Eisenhower administration, his face deeply lined and his eyes the color of old dimes. He wore a faded blue shirt with a name tag that read Earl in letters so worn I had to squint to make them out. When I asked about fuel, Earl just shook his head slowly and pointed toward a hand-lettered sign taped to the wall behind him that read "Pumps Out of Order." But when I turned to leave, he spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying the rough texture of someone who'd spent decades breathing cigarette smoke and highway dust. He told me I was welcome to wait out the rain if I wanted, that there was coffee in the pot and it wouldn't cost me anything. Something in his tone suggested it might be wise to accept his hospitality, though I couldn't have explained why. The coffee was surprisingly good, rich and dark, with none of the bitter bite I'd come to expect from roadside establishments. I found myself settling into one of the cracked vinyl chairs near the window, watching the Ferris wheel continue its endless rotation through the rain-streaked glass. Each gondola was painted a different color, though the years and weather had faded them to muted pastels that looked almost ghostly in the uncertain light. As I watched, I began to notice something that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable unease. It took me several minutes to be certain, but once I focused on following a single gondola through its circuit, there was no denying it. The thing was rotating counterclockwise, opposite to how every Ferris wheel I'd ever seen operate. When I mentioned this to Earl, he just nodded as if I'd commented on the weather and told me that it had been doing that for as long as he could remember. He said it sometimes bothered the tourists who stopped by, but that you got used to it after a while. I asked him how long the carnival had been there, and his answer sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain-cooled air seeping through the building's gaps and cracks. He said it had always been there, for as long as he'd been working the night shift, which was going on 37 years now. But when I pressed him about the carnival itself, about who ran it and when it was open to the public, his responses became vague and contradictory. Sometimes he'd say it was closed for the season. Other times he'd mention that they got visitors from time to time, mostly late at night. As the evening wore on and the rain showed no signs of letting up, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the window, watching that backward spinning wheel with growing fascination. There was something hypnotic about its motion, something that seemed to pull at the edges of my consciousness in a way that was both unsettling and oddly compelling. The music continued to drift through the walls, sometimes louder, sometimes so faint I wondered if I was imagining it, but always there, always playing that same hauntingly familiar melody. It was approaching midnight when I finally decided I'd waited long enough. The rain had lessened to a light drizzle, and I figured I had enough fuel to make it to the next truck stop if I kept my speed down and didn't run the auxiliary power unit. I thanked Earl for the coffee and hospitality, but as I reached for the door handle, he called out to me one more time. His words stopped me cold and sent ice water flowing through my veins. He told me to be careful on the road tonight, that sometimes drivers who stopped at the rest area had trouble finding their way back to the highway. He said the carnival had a way of calling to people, especially when the wheel was spinning backward like it was tonight. Most folks managed to resist the pull and get back on the road just fine, but every now and then someone would feel compelled to take a closer look at the rides. And those people, well, they didn't always make it back to their vehicles. The walk from the building to my truck felt like it took an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 50 yards. With each step, the music grew louder, more insistent, and I found my gaze drawn repeatedly to that slowly turning wheel. The gondolas creaked softly as they moved through their circuit, and I could have sworn I saw shapes inside some of them, shadowy figures that might have been people, or might have been tricks of the uncertain light. My hand was actually on the cab door handle when I heard it, a sound that made every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of driving scream at me to get away from that place as fast as I could manage. It was laughter, high and clear and joyful, the sound of children at play. But there were no children anywhere to be seen, just that backward spinning wheel and its empty gondolas cutting through the mist-laden air. I hauled myself up into the cab and fired up the engine without looking back. But as I pulled out of the parking space, my headlights swept across the Ferris wheel one final time. For just an instant, I could have sworn I saw them clearly, the figures in the gondolas, and they weren't children at all. They were adults, men, and women in clothing that looked decades out of date, and they were all waving at me, their faces bright with smiles that seemed far too wide for human features. The drive back to the highway should have taken less than 5 minutes, But somehow I found myself driving for nearly 20, following a road that seemed to curve and wind far more than it had when I'd arrived. The music followed me for miles, growing fainter but never quite disappearing, and in my rearview mirror I could see the glow of that Ferris wheel, spinning its backward circle against the night sky long after it should have been hidden by distance and terrain. When I finally reached the main highway and looked back one last time, there was nothing there but darkness and the ordinary silhouettes of hills against the cloudy sky. I drove straight through to Sacramento that night, stopping only for fuel at a well-lit truck stop that I'd used dozens of times before. I told myself that fatigue and the strange atmosphere of the place had played tricks on my perception, that there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for everything I'd experienced. But 3 weeks later, when I ran that route again, I made sure to top off my fuel tank before reaching mile marker 47. The sound of glass on metal. From Marcus Holloway. The rain started falling somewhere outside Bakersfield, California, and I remember thinking how odd it looked in my headlights, almost like tiny silver needles dropping from the black October sky. I'd been driving this route for 17 years, hauling freight from Los Angeles to Seattle, and I thought I knew every kind of weather the Pacific Coast could throw at a trucker. The radio crackled with weather advisories about an unusual storm system moving inland from the ocean, something about atmospheric pressure and temperature inversions that I didn't pretend to understand. All I cared about was keeping my 18-wheeler steady on the asphalt and making my delivery deadline. My Peterbilt 309 had been my home away from home since 2018. A deep blue cab, with chrome that caught the light just right when I kept her clean. Tonight the chrome was getting its first real test against this strange precipitation. The raindrops hit my windshield with a sound I'd never heard before, a sharp ticking noise like fingernails tapping against glass, but faster and more insistent. My wipers worked overtime, sweeping back and forth in their familiar rhythm. But something felt different about the way the water moved across the glass. Interstate 5 stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, mostly empty except for the occasional set of taillights disappearing over the next hill. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and the green glow from my instruments created a cocoon of familiar light inside the cab. Outside, the world had become a wall of darkness punctuated only by the reflection of my running lights on the wet pavement. The engine hummed its steady diesel song, a sound that usually helped me think clearly during these long night hauls, but tonight something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the way the rain seemed to cling to my windshield longer than it should have. Normal rainwater runs down glass in predictable patterns, following gravity and the slight angle of the windshield, but these drops seemed to hesitate, almost as if they were exploring the surface before finally sliding away. I adjusted my wipers to a faster setting, watching the rubber blades work harder than usual to clear my view. The sound they made was different too, a harsh scraping noise that set my teeth on edge. 20 miles north of Bakersfield, I pulled into a truck stop to fuel up and grab some coffee. The parking lot was nearly deserted, just a few other rigs scattered under the pale yellow lights. As I climbed down from my cab, the rain hit my bare arms with a sensation that made me flinch. It didn't feel like water. Each drop carried a tiny sting, like being touched by something sharp and cold. I hurried toward the building, my boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon signs with an unusual clarity, as if the water was somehow more reflective than it should be. Inside the truck stop, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while I poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long on the burner. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, glanced up from her magazine as I approached the counter. "Weird weather tonight," she said, nodding toward the rain-streaked windows. "Had 3 drivers come through in the last hour talking about it. One guy said it was scratching up his paint job." I paid for the coffee and a bag of chips, thinking about what she'd said. Outside, I walked slowly around my truck, running my hand along the blue paint. In the artificial light of the parking lot, I could see thin, hairline scratches covering the surface of my cab, thousands of tiny marks that definitely hadn't been there when I'd started my run. They were so fine they were almost invisible, but they covered every exposed surface, like some kind of intricate pattern etched by an invisible hand. Back in the cab, I tried to convince myself it was just road debris, or maybe something in the air. But as I pulled back onto the interstate, the sound of the rain intensified. What had been a gentle ticking was now a constant scratching noise, like claws dragging across metal and glass. I turned up the radio, trying to find some music to mask the sound, but every station seemed to be filled with static that matched the rhythm of the precipitation outside. The highway curved through a series of low hills, and I noticed that my headlight beams were catching something unusual in the falling rain. Instead of the typical silver streaks you see when light hits water droplets, there were tiny flashes of reflection, as if each drop contained something crystalline or metallic. I slowed down, partly out of caution, and partly because I was becoming genuinely unnerved by what I was experiencing. My CB radio crackled to life, and a voice emerged from the static. Any drivers northbound on 5 near Coalinga, you might want to find some place to wait this out. This ain't normal rain. The voice was strained, and I could hear the same scratching sound I was experiencing coming through the speaker in the background of his transmission. I've been driving for 30 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like this. It's eating through my clear coat. This is Big Blue northbound at mile marker 2. Copy on the weird precipitation. You seeing the same thing I am? If you're seeing rain that looks like it's got glass in it, then yeah, we're in the same boat, or the same nightmare. I'm pulled over at the Coalinga exit, and I can watch it stripping paint off my trailer in real time. Little curls of paint coming off like wood shaving. The thought of pulling over crossed my mind, but something about sitting still while this stuff fell from the sky seemed worse than keeping moving. At least with the truck in motion, I felt like I had some control over the situation. I thanked the driver and continued north, watching my speedometer and listening to the increasingly loud scratching symphony playing across my truck's surface. Mile after mile, the sound grew more intense. It was no longer just rain hitting metal and glass. It had become a constant scraping noise, like hundreds of tiny fingernails working away at every surface of my truck. The windshield was still mostly clear thanks to the wipers, but I could see that the rubber blades themselves were starting to deteriorate, leaving thin black streaks across the glass with each pass. At mile marker 2095, my engine temperature gauge started climbing. The scratching rain was apparently affecting my radiator, clogging it with some kind of residue, or wearing away at the cooling fins. I had to make a choice: push through and risk engine damage, or find shelter and wait it out. The problem was there wasn't much shelter available on this stretch of highway, just empty fields and the occasional overpass. I spotted the lights of a rest area ahead and made the decision to pull in. Better to assess the damage and maybe wait out the storm than to push forward and risk being stranded with a blown engine in the middle of nowhere. As I guided the truck into the rest area, I could see that the few cars parked there were covered with the same fine scratches that decorated my cab, their surfaces looking like they'd been worked over with steel wool. The rest area had a small building with restrooms and vending machines, but more importantly, it had a covered pavilion where I could park and get out of the direct path of whatever was falling from the sky. As I maneuvered under the concrete roof, the scratching sound stopped so abruptly that the silence felt almost violent. My ears rang from the sudden absence of the noise that had been building for the past hour. I climbed down from the cab and walked around my truck with a flashlight, surveying the damage. The scratches were everywhere, covering every surface in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, like some kind of alien script etched into the metal and fiberglass. The chrome bumper and exhaust stacks, which I'd polished to a mirror finish just days ago, were now dull and covered with thousands of tiny gouges. My beautiful blue paint job looked like it had been attacked with the finest sandpaper imaginable. But it was the windshield that really unsettled me. While the wipers had kept it mostly clear during the drive, I could now see that the glass itself was covered with microscopic scratches, so many and so fine that they created a kind of frosted effect. Looking through the windshield was like looking through a window that had been etched with acid, distorting everything just enough to make it seem alien and wrong. I tried my cell phone, thinking I should call my dispatcher or maybe report the strange weather to someone, but I had no signal. The radio in the truck picked up only static, and even the emergency channels were silent. It was as if the storm had created some kind of interference that cut off all communication with the outside world. From under the pavilion, I could see the rain continuing to fall in the open areas of the rest stop. In the beam of my flashlight, each drop caught the light like a tiny mirror, and I realized that what I was seeing wasn't water at all, or at least not entirely water. The fading voice. From Marcus Chen. The 18-wheeler's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided her down Interstate 80 through the heart of Nevada, watching the endless stretch of asphalt disappear beneath my headlights, like a black river flowing toward tomorrow. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green, reading 2:47 in the morning, and the CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant voices of other night drivers sharing their loneliness with the desert air. My cargo of electronics, bound for Sacramento, had been riding smooth for the past 600 miles, and I was making good time despite the light drizzle that had started falling an hour back, painting my windshield with tiny diamonds that caught the glow of passing mile markers. That's when I saw him standing beside the on-ramp near Fernley, thumb extended toward the road, his figure illuminated briefly by my approaching headlights before disappearing back into the shadows between the sparse streetlights. Something about the way he stood there, perfectly still despite the rain beginning to intensify, made me tap the brake pedal and feel the familiar shudder of the air brakes engaging. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, and I'd picked up my share of hitchhikers over the decades, mostly folks down their luck who needed a ride to the next town or state, and tonight something in my gut told me this stranger needed help more than most. I pulled the big rig onto the shoulder with a hiss of compressed air and watched in my side mirror as the figure approached through the rain, his footsteps creating small splashes in the puddles that were forming along the roadside. When he climbed up into the passenger seat, got my first good look at him in the dome light's pale yellow glow. He appeared to be somewhere in his 30s, with sandy brown hair that was damp from the rain, and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days, though they weren't exactly shabby either. His face had a kind of timeless quality to it, the sort of features that could have belonged to someone from any decade of the past 50 years, and his eyes held a depth that seemed older than his apparent age. "Appreciate the ride," he said, settling into the worn fabric seat and pulling the door closed with a solid thunk that cut off the sound of rain drumming on the cab's roof. His voice carried a slight accent that I couldn't quite place, something that might have been from the Midwest but with subtle inflections that suggested he'd traveled widely. "Name's Daniel, and I'm trying to get to Reno, if you're heading that direction." The way he spoke was careful and measured, as if he was choosing each word with deliberate precision, and there was something almost musical about his cadence that made me want to keep listening. I shifted the truck back into gear and felt the familiar surge of power as we rejoined the flow of sparse late-night traffic, the rain now coming down harder and forcing me to increase the windshield wiper speed to maintain visibility. "Marcus," I replied, glancing over at my passenger as he buckled his seatbelt, with movements that seemed oddly graceful. "Reno's right on my route, so you're in luck. I'd have you there in about 2 hours if this weather doesn't get any worse." The heater was running at a comfortable level, filling the cab with warm air that carried the faint sense of diesel fuel and the pine air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror. Daniel nodded and settled back into his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap, as he gazed out at the landscape rolling past in the darkness beyond our headlight beams. "Beautiful country out here at night," he observed, his voice carrying that same careful quality that had struck me when he first spoke. "There's something about the desert that makes you feel like you're traveling through time itself, like the boundaries between past and present become thin as paper." The observation was more philosophical than most hitchhikers offered, and I found myself nodding in agreement as we passed another mile marker glowing briefly in our lights before vanishing back into the rainy darkness. We talked about the usual things that come up during long-haul conversations, the weather and road conditions in the various towns we'd both seen in our travels, but Daniel had stories about places that seemed to span decades of experience, despite his relatively young appearance. He spoke about a diner in Bakersfield that had served the best apple pie in California back in the 70s, describing the red vinyl booths and the owner's habit of humming old Elvis songs while he worked the grill. Details so vivid I could almost smell the coffee and hear the sizzle of bacon on the griddle. When I mentioned that the diner had probably changed hands multiple times since then, Daniel just smiled and said that some places exist outside of normal time, preserved in memory long after their physical form has changed or disappeared entirely. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the windshield, and the highway stretched ahead of us like a ribbon of wet obsidian reflecting our headlights back in fractured patterns. Daniel continued sharing stories about truck stops and roadside attractions he'd encountered over the years, his voice maintaining that same measured, almost hypnotic quality that made the miles pass easily. He described a particular truck stop near Elko, where the coffee was always perfectly fresh no matter what time of night you arrived, and where the waitress named Betty knew exactly how every regular driver liked his eggs prepared. Remembering preferences across months and years of intermittent visits, there was this driver, big guy named Kowalski, who'd been running loads between Seattle and Phoenix for 20 years. Betty knew he wanted his coffee black with just a touch of cinnamon, and she'd have it ready before he even sat down at the counter. He told me that night about how the road gets into your blood after a while, becomes part of who you are until you can't imagine any other way of living. The story felt familiar somehow, like something I might have experienced myself, though I couldn't recall ever meeting anyone named Kowalski or stopping at that particular truck stop Daniel described. As we passed through Wadsworth, the small town's scattered lights, creating brief pools of illumination in the darkness, Daniel began talking about the history of the area, how the railroad had first brought settlers through this valley in the late 1800s, and how the old wagon trails could still be seen from certain vantage points, if you knew where to look. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, covering details about mining operations and railroad construction that weren't the sort of things most people picked up casually. When I asked how he'd learned so much about local history, Daniel's voice became slightly distant, as he explained that he'd always been drawn to stories about people traveling through unfamiliar territory, seeking something better in the next town or the next state. The dashboard clock showed 4:15 when Daniel started telling me about a family he'd met years earlier. Couple with 2 young children who'd been driving cross-country in an old station wagon that had broken down near Sparks. The father was trying to fix the radiator himself, Daniel said, his voice growing softer as he continued, while the mother sat in the car with the kids, singing lullabies to keep them calm. It was one of those moments when you realize how fragile our plans really are, how quickly circumstances can change everything we think we know about where we're going. Something in his tone made me glance over at him, but his face was turned toward the passenger window, watching the rain-blurred landscape slide past in the darkness. I asked, and for a long moment Daniel didn't respond, his silence stretching out until it began to feel uncomfortable in the warm confines of the cab. When he finally spoke, his voice seemed to come from farther away than the passenger seat, as if he was speaking across a great distance or through some kind of barrier I couldn't see or understand. Sometimes people find exactly what they're looking for, Daniel said, his words becoming slightly harder to hear over the sound of rain and wind, and the steady rumble of the engine. And sometimes what they find isn't quite what they expected, but it's exactly what they needed. I was about to ask him what he meant when I realized that his voice had become so faint, I was straining to catch the words, even though he was sitting just a few feet away from me in the passenger seat. I turned my head to look at him directly, expecting to see Daniel still gazing out the window, but the passenger seat was empty, the seatbelt hanging loose against the worn fabric upholstery. The dome light wasn't on, so I couldn't see clearly into the corners of the cab, but there was nowhere for someone to hide in the confined space, and I hadn't heard the door open or felt the rush of cool air that would have accompanied someone stepping out of a moving vehicle. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing, or rather what I wasn't seeing, because the absence of my passenger felt more profound than simple emptiness.